Come, settle in now. Let the weight of the day find somewhere else to rest, and let yourself sink a little deeper into wherever you are lying, sitting, breathing quietly in the dark. Tonight we are going to travel a very long way, not across oceans or mountain ranges, though we will pass those too in time, but across the centuries themselves, back to a city that burned and glittered and hummed with more life than perhaps any place that has ever existed on this earth. We are going to Rome, and we are going to take our time getting there. Before we go any further, if these slow nighttime stories are the kind of company you like to keep, it might be worth finding your way back to this channel and keeping it close. Subscribing, perhaps, so that the stories are always waiting for you when the night comes and the world grows quiet. And if you feel like leaving a word in the comments, just a small one, nothing more than where in the world you are listening from tonight, please do. There are people drifting towards sleep right now in cities and villages across the globe, and there is something quietly lovely about knowing that, about this little community of sleepless listeners breathing together across so many different darknesses. But now, gently, let us begin. Close your eyes and imagine the light first, not the clean electric light of the world you know, but something warmer and more restless, the light of oil lamps burning in clay vessels, their flames trembling in the faintest movement of air, casting long amber shades against walls of pale plaster and dark tufa stone. This is the light of Rome, of the 1st century after the birth of Christ, a light that was never quite still, never quite reliable, always alive, in the way that only fire is alive. In every home, in every corridor of every palace and tavern and temple, the lamps were burning, hundreds of thousands of them across a city of perhaps 1 million souls, which was in those days the most populous city in the known world, 1 million people breathing and eating and arguing and sleeping under the same smoky, lustrous sky. Imagine now the sound that rises from such a city in the long hours before dawn. The Roman day, you should know, was a noisy one, so noisy, in fact, that the heaviest wheeled carts were forbidden from the city streets during daylight hours, and so they came at night instead. If you were lying in a Roman apartment building, one of those tall and somewhat precarious structures the Romans called insulae, islands of human life stacked 5 and 6 stories high, you would have heard the grinding of iron-rimmed wheels over cobblestone, beginning in the darkness and continuing until the sky began to pale. The mules and oxen that pulled those carts were not quiet animals. The drivers called to each other across the narrow streets. A dog was always barking. Somewhere above, a baby was always crying, and underneath all of it, like the lowest string of some enormous and invisible instrument, was the sound of the city simply breathing, the vast collective exhalation of 1 million lives proceeding, moment by moment, through the night. But by the time the sun began to climb above the 7 hills, the carts had retreated, and the city transformed itself into something else entirely. The streets filled with people, not the polite, unhurried crowds of a modern shopping district, but dense and purposeful and vivid throngs. The bakers had been at work since before midnight, and now their stalls exhaled the smell of warm bread into the already complicated air, complicated with wood smoke and the iron-dark scent of the Tiber when the wind came from the west, with the green herbal sharpness of garlands hung at doorways for religious occasions, with fish sauce and olive oil and the sour note of cheap wine spilled on dry stone. Rome smelled like life. It smelled in its way like the whole world concentrated into a single city, because the whole world was, in a sense, precisely what Rome had become. The empire that spread outward from those 7 hills was, by the time our story takes shape, already very old and very large. To the north it reached into the cool green forests of what we now call France and Germany, lands of mist and dark rivers and tribes who painted themselves blue for war. To the east it extended through Greece, ancient, storied, already carrying its ruins with a kind of quiet dignity, and onward into the deserts and limestone cities of what we now call the Middle East, places that carried names even older than Rome. To the south, Egypt lay at the empire's feet, that golden and hieroglyph-covered civilization of the Nile, now a province, its grain flowing northward across the Mediterranean to feed the enormous appetites of the capital. And to the west, Hispania and the long Atlantic shore, where sailors stood and looked out at the gray, unknown ocean and felt, it must be said, quite certain there was nothing useful beyond it. All of this, all of it, was administered, theorized about, argued over, taxed, soldiered, and occasionally misgoverned from the city on the Tiber. Letters went out in every direction, written on wax tablets and papyrus scrolls, sealed with rings and carried by messengers who rode the finest roads in the ancient world. Those roads, the Romans were rightly proud of them, ran as straight as a thought from city to city, paved with large fitted stones, maintained by the army, marked with milestones so that you always knew how far you were from Rome. In the end, all the roads led back. They always led back. The Rome that our story inhabits is an imperial Rome, a Rome that has already passed through its centuries of kings and its centuries of republic, and arrived not entirely peacefully at the age of emperors. The first of these, Augustus, had shaped the city with an architect's ambition and a politician's patience, claiming to have found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble, which is said to have been nearly true, though the marble gleamed atop older and more complicated foundations. Augustus had died some decades before our story begins, and after him came Tiberius, who grew old and sour and suspicious on the island of Capri, watching the sea and trusting almost no one. And after Tiberius came Caligula, whose name it is easiest, for now, to simply set down on the table and leave there, for it carries its own weight, its own darkness, though tonight we are not yet ready to lift it. And after Caligula came Claudius, who stammered and shuffled and was underestimated by almost everyone, and who turned out to be rather more capable than anyone had supposed. These are the stones that form the path our story will walk. The emperors who came before the one we have come to talk about, each one leaving behind them a Rome slightly altered, slightly more accustomed to the strange and particular theater of absolute power. A theater in which everything could change at any moment, in which friendship was provisional, in which even blood was not always a guarantee of safety, though it was always a guarantee of significance. The Forum at the heart of the city was, in those days, still the beating center of Roman civic life. Columns of marble and travertine rising between the old temples, the faces of the buildings crowded with inscriptions and the records of the empire's business, and at its heart, a space where voices had echoed for centuries. Senators in their white togas with the broad purple stripe made their way to the curia in the mornings. Merchants argued over prices. Philosophers held their small audiences on steps worn smooth by generations of sandaled feet. Children ran between the columns, while their mothers called after them in the flat, practical Latin of everyday life. Not the sculpted Latin of the historians we will be drawing from tonight, but the quick, colloquial, occasionally quite rude Latin of a city that was, at its heart, full of people simply getting on with things. And above all of this, above the Forum and the markets and the bathhouses and the slender upper stories of the apartment buildings, above all the noise and smell and motion and life, rose the Palatine Hill. It was there that the emperors lived, on that gently elevated ground with its views across the city's rooftops, its gardens and colonnades and rooms decorated with the finest things the empire could reach out and take. The lamps burned there too, of course. They always burned there, through the night and into the day, in rooms where decisions were made that would ripple outward to the farthest edges of the known world. It is from that hill that our story will grow, but not yet. Tonight we are only settling in, only finding our feet in this ancient city, letting its sounds wash over us, and its lamplight warm the backs of our closed eyes. Let the Tiber move slowly in the dark. Let the last carts rumble away into silence. Let the first pale breath of morning still be a long, long way off. Soon we will begin to trace the life of one particular person, born at a particular moment, into a particular and very complicated family, and we will do it slowly, gently, step by careful step. But for now, there is only Rome, ancient and breathing, its oil lamps trembling in the dark. The sea was calm, the morning they say he came into the world. It is said that Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus was born at Antium, that coastal town south of Rome where the air carries salt and the sound of water folding against stone, where the light even in the cold months of December has a particular quality, pale and diffuse and almost tender, as though the sun itself were uncertain of the season. The year was 37 years after the birth of Christ, in the consulship of Gnaeus Acerronius Proculus and Gaius Petronius Pontius, and the empire was not yet a century old, and already the family into which this child had been born had accumulated enough glory and enough blood to fill several lifetimes of story. His father was Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, a man whose name carried the weight of an ancient and distinguished lineage, the Ahenobarbi, the Bronzebeards, as the Romans called them, a family whose men were said to be fierce and hot-tempered by nature, as if the reddish tinge of their famous beards ran somehow deeper than the skin. The story goes that the patriarch of the family earned that name when two divine young men, the twins Castor and Pollux, appeared to him on a Roman road and told him of a military victory, and as proof of their divinity, they touched his dark beard and it turned the color of burnished copper. Whether or not one chooses to believe that particular legend matters very little at this distance, but what it tells us about how the Ahenobarbi thought of themselves as a family touched by something extraordinary and destined for more than ordinary lives, that matters a great deal for understanding the world into which this infant boy arrived. Gnaeus Domitius, the father, was by most accounts not a gentle man. The histories that have come down to us describe him as cruel and dissolute, a man who had been accused at various times of offenses that the Romans considered gravely serious, and there is very little in the record that speaks warmly of him. It is said, though the sources are not always in agreement on this, that when friends congratulated him on the birth of his son, he replied that nothing born of himself and Agrippina could possibly be other than a disaster for the world. Whether he truly said this, or whether later historians, knowing how the story would end, placed those words in his mouth for the sake of a darkly satisfying symmetry, we cannot say with any certainty, but it is a detail that lodges itself in the mind, and it tells us something about the atmosphere of unease and foreboding that surrounded this family even in the ordinary moments that should have been cause for nothing but quiet celebration. The mother was another matter entirely. Agrippina the younger was 21 years old when her son was born, and she was already one of the most consequential women alive in the Roman world. She was the daughter of the beloved general Germanicus, whose name still moved through Roman memory like a warm current, the people's hero, the soldier who had fought in the northern forests and stood among the bones of Roman soldiers fallen at the Teutoburg disaster, and who had died young and been mourned with a grief that bordered on the inconsolable. Agrippina carried her father's name and her father's legacy and her father's extraordinary looks, and she knew exactly what all of this was worth in the ruthless mathematics of Roman power. She also carried the bloodline of Augustus himself, the first and greatest of the emperors, and she was the sister of Caligula, who at the very moment of her son's birth had been emperor for less than a year, his reign still new and not yet showing the signs of what it would become. The family she had married into and the family she had been born into were both, in their different ways, formidable things to carry. But the house of the Julio-claudians, as scholars would come to call them, the tangled dynasty that stretched from Augustus through Tiberius and Caligula toward the future, was not a family in any ordinary domestic sense. It was something closer to a slow and continuous struggle for survival, in which proximity to power was both the greatest prize and the greatest danger, and in which the distance between imperial favor and ruin could close in a single afternoon. Agrippina knew this better than most. She had grown up watching it. The town of Antium itself, where the infant Lucius first drew breath, was a place the emperors had long favored. It sat on the Tyrrhenian coast, its rocky shore catching the light in long, flat glimmers, its air softer than the city air of Rome, and its rhythm slower, governed more by tide and weather than by the relentless machinery of Roman political life. The sound of the sea was ever present there, the low and patient repetition of waves, moving through the day and the night without any particular urgency, as if time at Antium were measured differently, in swells rather than hours. There were temples there, and villas, and the long porticos, where one could walk in the salt wind and look out toward a horizon that promised nothing except more water and more sky. Augustus himself had loved Antium. Caligula, too, had been born there. It was a place that seemed to gather the Julio-claudians to it, as though the sea at that particular latitude had some understanding of their story. But the peace of the coast was something of an illusion for this new family. Gnaeus Domitius was already in uncertain health, and would not live to see his son reach the age of 3. The relationship between him and Agrippina was not, as far as the record shows, anything resembling a warm partnership. And beyond the walls of their Antium household, the world was governed by Caligula, who in those first months of his reign was still performing the role of a reasonable and even beloved ruler, but in whom there were already, perhaps, those signs that only later came to seem obvious. Agrippina existed in that reign as a figure of some complexity, close enough to power to be visible, and therefore potentially dangerous in the way that all visible women were dangerous in imperial Rome, where beauty and lineage and ambition were not qualities that emperors typically found comforting in their sisters. The child himself lay somewhere in all of this, unknowing, as children do, small and new, and absolutely without agency, in a world that was already busy arranging his fate. He had the reddish tinge of the Ahenobarbie in his coloring, it is said, and the pale eyes that sometimes ran in that family, and whatever he was feeling in those first days of December on the Antium coast, we can be sure it was not yet the weight of the name he carried, or the complications of the dynasty into which he had been born. He was, for just a little while, simply an infant by the sea, with the sound of the water reaching him through the walls of whatever room held his cradle, steady and rhythmic, and entirely indifferent to the question of who he was, or who he might one day become. The months that followed his birth were not particularly kind ones in the wider world. Caligula's behavior began, by degrees, to shift. The Senate, which had received him with such genuine relief after the long chill of Tiberius's later years, was beginning to feel something different, a wariness, a new anxiety that it could not quite name. The eastern provinces and the northern frontiers continued their own slow business, as they always did, largely unaware of the moods of the man in the Palatine palace, but in Rome itself, the air was changing. And within that changing air, the woman who had just given birth to a boy at Antium was watching and calculating and already thinking in ways that went considerably further than the present moment. It is not difficult, looking back from this great distance, to feel something almost tender for the child at the center of all this complexity. He would not remain innocent of it for long. The world he had been born into would make its demands known soon enough, and the years that followed his birth would be marked by losses and upheavals, and the particular loneliness that belongs to children who live at the edges of dangerous power. But for now, in that first quiet season of his life, there was still the sea at Antium, doing what it had always done, folding and unfolding against the stones in that slow, unhurried way, carrying its salt smell inland on the wind, filling the silences between all the larger sounds of the world. That sound would stay with him, perhaps in some place beneath memory, the earliest thing, the first texture of a life that would grow so much louder and so much more complicated than those first December days by the water. And as we let that image settle, the infant, the sea, the pale winter light, we are moving now gently toward the years that came next, the childhood that waited for him, which was in its own quiet way, its own kind of storm. The rain had come again to the city of Antium, soft and persistent, the kind that gathers in the low places between stones and sits there for days, reflecting a sky the color of old pewter. Somewhere in the distance, the sea shifted and exhaled, as it always did along that particular stretch of coastline, indifferent to the lives being lived in the houses above it, indifferent to the nurses and the household servants moving quietly through corridors, indifferent to the small boy at the center of all that careful, anxious movement, who could not yet have known that the world around him was anything other than what it seemed. Lucius was very young when the first great disruption came. He had been born, as we settled into last night, into a family that wore its dangers the way other families wear their finest clothes, always at every occasion and with a kind of terrible elegance. His father, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, was a man of distinguished family and unremarkable character, and he died when Lucius was still only 2 or 3 years old, before the boy could have formed any lasting impression of him, any solid memory to carry forward into the difficult years ahead. What remained after that death was an inheritance of name and blood and property, and then almost immediately, even those things were taken away. It is said, and the ancient sources suggest it clearly enough, that upon his father's death the boy's estate was seized, absorbed into the accounts of the Emperor Caligula, who was by this time the most powerful and perhaps the most volatile person in the known world. Caligula was Lucius's uncle, connected by the complicated web of Julian and Claudian bloodlines that tied everyone in that imperial family together in relationships that were simultaneously intimate and deeply, chronically unsafe. To be related to the emperor was to be at once protected by proximity and endangered by it, because the same closeness that might earn favor in one season could, in the shifting moods of a man like Caligula, become the very reason for suspicion in the next. And then there was the matter of his mother, Agrippina the Younger, whose story we will follow much more closely in the chapters ahead, because her story is so thoroughly woven into her son's, was, in these early years of Lucius's life, herself in a precarious and shifting position. She was proud, intelligent, politically astute in ways that most people around her would not have fully appreciated, and she was also at the mercy of a brother emperor who was none of those things, or rather who was all of them only intermittently and dangerously. The story goes that Caligula, whose behavior toward his sisters moved between excessive warmth and sudden furious coldness, eventually turned against Agrippina in a way that had real and lasting consequences. She was accused, along with her sister Livilla, of involvement in a conspiracy. It is not entirely clear how much truth lay in this accusation, and historians across the centuries have handled the question with varying degrees of certainty. And the result of that accusation was exile. Exile in the Roman world meant a particular kind of erasure. It did not mean death, which might in some ways have been more legible, more final. It meant instead a removal from the city, from the society, from the networks of relationship and influence that constituted a meaningful life for a person of rank. It meant the islands, cold, wind-scoured, remote, and the sense of being placed outside the story of one's own time, suspended, while history continued without you. Agrippina was sent away, and her son was left behind. Left behind is perhaps not quite the right way to put it, because he was not simply left in comfort and safety while his mother suffered at a distance. He was placed in the household of his father's sister, Domitia Lepida, a woman who by various accounts was neither warm nor particularly invested in the welfare of the child in her care. It is said that the two people assigned to oversee his early education during this period were a dancer and a barber, not the philosophers and rhetoricians that a boy of his lineage might reasonably have expected, not the careful, dedicated tutors who would have shaped his mind toward the exercises of reason and governance. There is something quietly telling in that detail, something that speaks to a household where the child was present, but not quite the point, where he existed in the margins of other people's lives without anyone arranging things with his future meaningfully in view. We should take a moment to sit with what that might have felt like, not in any dramatic or distressing way, but simply to let it settle into its true texture. A small boy, somewhere between 3 and 5 years old, in a house that was not quite his, with a guardian who was not quite caring, learning from teachers who were not quite appropriate, waiting for a mother who was not yet able to return. The days would have had their rhythms nonetheless, the light through the windows moving from pale morning to the thick amber warmth of afternoon, the sounds of the household going about its work, the smells of bread and oil, and whatever flowers happened to be in season, climbing the walls of whatever courtyard was nearby. Children have a remarkable capacity to inhabit the ordinary surface of their days, even when the deeper structure of their lives is uncertain. And no doubt Lucius did the same, moving through his days with the unself-conscious absorption that very young children bring to everything, unaware that he was living in a period that would later be described by historians as one of danger and deprivation, and yet it was also quietly a period of formation. The things that happen to us before we can fully understand them have a way of settling into the body, into the habits of attention and expectation that we carry forward without knowing we carry them. A child raised in uncertainty learns to read atmospheres carefully, learns to sense shifts in mood before they become explicit, learns something about the relationship between proximity to power and the fragility of safety. Whether or not Lucius could have articulated any of this, of course he could not. The experience of these years was nevertheless becoming part of him, laying down something that would later shape the way he moved through the world, which had begun with such extraordinary popular goodwill, Such genuine public relief, after the long and oppressive final years of Tiberius, had by this point descended into something that even sympathetic contemporaries found difficult to describe coherently. The stories that survive from those years are extraordinary, and some of them are almost certainly exaggerated by the writers who recorded them decades later, shaped by the convenient narrative that casts Caligula as a figure of pure excess and madness, a useful villain against whom other emperors could be measured favorably. But allowing for the distortions of time and politics in the historical record, what remains is still a picture of an administration characterized by fear, by sudden violence, by the sense that no one, regardless of their rank or their previous good standing, was entirely safe from arbitrary imperial attention. For a family like the one Lucius had been born into, this atmosphere was not abstract. It was the actual texture of life. It was the reason that households like Domitia Lepida's moved carefully, spoke carefully, arranged their activities so as not to draw notice. Silence in such times becomes its own skill, the art of being unremarkable, of not presenting any surface that might catch the light of imperial suspicion. And then in the year that historians would later mark as 41 years after the birth of Christ, Caligula was gone. The circumstances of his death, the conspiracy of the Praetorian Guard, the specific details of the final day, we will set aside for now, because this is not Caligula's story, and the night is soft, and we are not here to linger in violent places. What matters for our story is the consequence. A new emperor, Claudius, who was Caligula's uncle, and who came to the throne in a way that was surprised, stumbling, almost accidental, or at least so the story goes. And with a new emperor came the possibility of other things changing. Exiles could be recalled, cold households could be vacated, mothers could return along roads that had been closed to them for too long. Agrippina came back, and whatever the house of Domitia Lepida had felt like, whatever particular quality of provisional, dimly lit, insufficient safety it had offered, the world now shifted again, the way it had a habit of doing in this family, though this time the shift moved in a gentler direction. The boy who would become Nero was perhaps 5 or 6 years old when his mother reappeared in his life, and the house they came to inhabit together under the new reign of Claudius would have its own textures, its own smells of lamp oil and polished stone, its own particular quality of late afternoon light falling across marble floors. That life, the life of the palace, the life of Rome arranging itself around a new emperor and a returned exile and her ambitious plans, is the place our story will carry us next, when you are ready to follow it there. For now, the rain has quieted in Antium, and the sea breathes slowly in the dark. The hour before dawn on the Palatine hill is a thing of extraordinary quiet. There is a moment, suspended somewhere between the last cool darkness of night and the first gray loosening of the sky, when the great palace complex sits in almost perfect stillness, when the marble corridors breathe softly, when the oil in the lamps has burned low and the flames have settled into their smallest, most intimate selves, trembling so gently that the shadows on the painted walls seem less like shadows and more like the slow exhalations of the walls themselves. The painted figures there, gods and heroes, laureled and serene, appear in that half-light to be merely resting, as you are resting now, waiting for the world to remember them again. This is the Palatine Hill in the early years of the 1st century of the Common Era, and it is worth pausing here, worth settling into the textures and temperatures of this place before the story moves any further forward, because so much of what follows will happen within these walls, or in the long shadows they cast across everything else. The hill itself was the oldest of Rome's 7, the one the poets and the historians always return to, the one where the city's mythological founders were said to have first looked out across the low marshland of the future Forum and decided that here was where a great thing might begin. By the time we find ourselves here, it had long since been terraced and built upon again, its slopes given over almost entirely to the residences of emperors and the households that surrounded them, a layered world of audience chambers and private apartments, of colonnaded gardens open to the sky, of bath suites and libraries, and the small, intimate rooms where real life, quieter than history, actually took place. The smell of the place in the early morning is the first thing to notice. There is always the faint sweetness of lamp oil, olive oil for the most part, sometimes scented with a little saffron or myrrh in the more formal rooms, and beneath that, a deeper coolness that comes from the stone itself, from the thick walls that hold the night's temperature long into the morning and make the corridors feel like the inside of a well-sealed jar. There is also, on mornings when the wind comes from the right direction, the green and slightly mineral smell of the gardens, where water runs through channels cut in stone and falls into rectangular pools that reflect whatever sky happens to be forming above them. The gardens wake before the palace does, well before the household stirs. The men and women responsible for the outdoor spaces have begun their slow circuits, checking the trellised roses that climb the south-facing walls, clearing the overnight fall of leaves from the pool surfaces with long-handled tools, carrying water to the potted plants arranged along the terraces in great terracotta vessels the color of dried blood. They move in the early light with the unhurried efficiency of people who have done these things so many times that the tasks have become a kind of thoughtless prayer, the body remembering what the mind no longer needs to attend to. Inside, the waking follows its own careful sequence. The first to move through the interior corridors are the slaves whose work is invisible, the ones who replenish the oil in the lamps before the household rises, so that no one of importance ever encounters a flame that has gone out, who carry away the evidence of the night, who lay fresh linen over surfaces and arrange the small objects of daily life, cups, styluses, boxes of polished wood, with a precision that looks, from a distance, like the objects arrange themselves in the night out of simple dignity. This is worth sitting with for a moment. In a world without any source of artificial light beyond flame, the management of light is one of the great ongoing negotiations of daily existence. And in a palace of this scale, the number of lamps burning at any given hour is astonishing. Small terracotta oil lamps with single wicks in the servants' passageways, bronze hanging lamps in the audience chambers, elaborate candelabra of wrought iron and gilded bronze in the dining rooms, and the rooms reserved for the emperor's private use. The light they produce is warm and slightly amber, softer than anything we might think of as adequate now, full of movement, and it turns every surface it touches into something golden and provisional, as if the whole world of the palace exists in a permanent late afternoon, perpetually on the edge of evening. By mid-morning, the hill is fully alive with a sound that is not quite noise and not quite silence, but something in between. A low, continuous texture of human activity. Footsteps on marble that ring differently depending on whether the walker wears sandals of soft leather or the harder-soled shoes of the clerks and administrators who circulate through the more public wings. The particular acoustic of a large colonnade, where voices arrive at you slightly altered, slightly rounded, as if the stone is softening everything it hears. The scratch of a stylus on a wax tablet, the distant, barely audible sound of water moving through the pipe system that feeds the baths, a sound like a river heard from very far away, patient and continuous. The food of the palace moves through it on trays carried by people who seem almost to float, trained to walk without the sound of effort, trained to appear and disappear from a room as smoothly as a thought. In the kitchens below, which occupy a whole buried world of their own, warm, steam-filled, fragrant with cumin and fish sauce and the sweet sharpness of reduced wine, the labor is constant and unglamorous and utterly essential, and the men and women who perform it rarely see the rooms their work passes through, the tables on which their dishes are set, the faces of the people who eat them. The bathrooms in the private imperial suite are lined with marble that has been polished to the point where it holds within it the shape of the light, a kind of frozen glow in the stone itself. The water that fills the pools arrives warm, heated by a system of furnaces and channels that runs beneath the floors, and the steam that rises from it drifts against the painted ceiling and collects in small clouds along the upper corners of the room, so that bathing here, it is said, feels less like washing and more like entering a very civilized version of the clouds. In the afternoon, the light changes across the gardens, tilting from the overhead brightness of midday into something longer and more golden, and the shadows of the columns begin their slow rotation across the marble floors, like the hands of a clock made of sunlight and stone. The air in the gardens cools slightly, and takes on the smell of warm cypress, and the dry, faintly dusty sweetness of herbs growing in terracotta, rosemary and bay, and the low gray cushions of thyme that have been planted along the path edges. Birds come to the garden in the afternoon in some numbers, and their sounds fill the open spaces, with something that is not quite music and not quite conversation, but has qualities of both. By evening, the lamps have been refilled, and the household has gathered itself for the main meal of the day. The dining rooms of the palace, or at least the more intimate of them, the ones used for family rather than formal occasion, are smaller than the audience chambers and have a quality of enclosure that feels almost tender. The walls are painted in deep colors, the particular rich red-orange that Roman fresco painters seem to love, and a warm ochre, and in some rooms, a green so dark it is almost black, against which painted birds and flowers and architectural fantasies appear to float in their own private space. The couches on which the diners recline are upholstered in cloth that catches the lamplight and holds it softly. And then, as the meal concludes and the household moves through its last gradual surrenders to the night, the lamps in the outer rooms extinguished one by one, the corridors emptying, the voices fading down to nothing, the Palatine hill returns to something approaching the stillness it held before dawn, that same deep, stone-cooled quiet, those same low amber flames in the few lamps left burning to guide anyone who might need to move through the dark. This is the world that Nero will grow into, and that his mother Agrippina, returned now from exile, purposeful and watchful and already planning, is beginning, quietly and with great patience, to navigate on his behalf. The lamps of the palace burn on through the night, casting their warm light across the painted walls, waiting for what morning will bring. The evening has grown quieter now, and the city of Rome has begun to fold itself inward, the way cities do when the last light leaves the hills and the lamps take over, one by one, filling window after window with that soft, trembling amber that seems less like illumination than like warmth given a visible shape. It is in this kind of light that the most patient plans are made, the ones that do not announce themselves with noise or urgency, but simply begin, the way a river begins, somewhere far back in the hills, with nothing more dramatic than a trickle of cold water, finding the path of least resistance, following gravity, following necessity, following an intelligence older than thought. And so we return tonight to Agrippina the Younger, who understood patience the way a sculptor understands stone, not as an obstacle, but as the very material from which something lasting might be made. When the Emperor Caligula died in the early days of the year that Rome counted as the 794th since its founding, the world of the imperial family shifted in the way that a floor shifts during an earthquake, everything that had seemed fixed, suddenly proving itself capable of movement, of collapse, of rearrangement. Claudius, the uncle no one had taken seriously, the man the story goes was hidden behind a curtain by the Praetorian Guard, who found him trembling after the assassination, became emperor almost by accident, or so the story has always seemed to suggest. He was bookish, physically unsteady, prone to a stammer that courtiers had long used as license to dismiss him, and yet he was there, and he was alive, and in the brutal arithmetic of succession, those two facts were enough. Agrippina had spent the final years of Caligula's reign in exile, banished to the Pontian Islands, those small rocky shapes rising from the Tyrrhenian Sea with their thin soil and their constant wind off the water. It is said that she carried her dead husband's ashes with her in her own hands during an earlier journey across that same sea, a gesture so deliberate, so freighted with visible grief and silent accusation that it had moved great crowds to tears along the road to Rome. She knew, even then, the weight that symbols carry. She understood that grief, properly displayed, is a form of power, and that the woman who is seen to have suffered is the woman who cannot easily be dismissed. When Claudius recalled her from exile and restored her to Rome, she did not return as a woman undone by hardship. She returned as someone who had spent those island years not in despair, but in a kind of cold, clear thinking, the sort that only solitude and necessity can produce. The wind off the Tyrrhenian had scoured away whatever softness the court had once permitted her, and what remained was something harder, more precise, more purposeful. She was still young, still striking, in the way that the portraits and the written descriptions suggest, with the high cheekbones of the Julian line and the kind of composure that reads as serenity until you look a little longer and begin to understand that it is something else entirely. Rome welcomed her back, and Rome watched her. The city had always been a place of watching, of reading faces across the length of a banquet hall, of measuring the angle of a nod, the timing of a silence. Agrippina moved through those spaces with a precision that the watching eyes could not help but admire, even when they feared it. She was the daughter of Germanicus, beloved general, beloved son of Rome, a man so genuinely mourned at his early death that the city had gone into a grief it could not quite explain. So deep did the feeling run. She carried that inheritance openly, not boastfully, but as a woman who knows that she need not announce what everyone in the room already knows. Claudius had married twice before, most recently a woman named Messalina, whose story had ended in a spectacular collapse of intrigue and execution, not long before Agrippina's return to prominence. The emperor, it is said, found the business of choosing a new wife both urgent and uncomfortable, the way a man of his temperament might find most things that required decisive social navigation. And it was here, in this particular gap, this particular moment of Claudius's uncertainty, that Agrippina moved with the quiet precision she had been cultivating across all the years of exile and loss. The ancient sources are not always in agreement about exactly how it came about, and we should hold them gently, the way you might hold something old and slightly fragile. But the shape of the story they tell is this: that Agrippina made herself necessary, made herself present, made herself the obvious and inevitable answer to a question the emperor had not quite finished asking. She was, after all, his niece, which made the marriage require a special dispensation, a bending of the usual Roman rules around such unions, and it is said that the senator Vitellius argued before the Senate on the matter with considerable rhetorical warmth, and that the Senate complied, and that Rome, which had seen stranger things, adjusted its understanding of what was normal and moved on. They were married then, Claudius and Agrippina, in the year that we might count as 49 in the common reckoning, and from that moment forward the pace of her planning did not slow, but rather seemed to find a steadier, more confident rhythm, like a piece of music that has found its key and settled into it. She was empress now. She bore the title Augusta, a word that carried in its syllables the full accumulated weight of what Rome meant by greatness, by permanence, by the sanction of something larger than any single human life. And always, in everything, there was Nero, her son, who was still a boy, still young enough that the shape of him was not yet fully declared, but old enough that she could see what he might become if the path were cleared, if the stones were moved, if the right people were placed in the right positions. She secured for him the betrothal to Claudia Octavia, the emperor's own daughter, a connection that bound him closer to the succession than any argument alone could have managed. She worked to have him appear alongside Claudius in the public ceremonies of the city, the parades, the rituals, the moments when Rome gathered to look at its own power and feel reassured by it. Every such appearance was a small deposit in an account she was building toward a future that she could see more clearly than anyone else in the city, perhaps more clearly than Nero himself. The lamps burned in the palace on the Palatine hill through all of this, through the negotiations and the arrangements, and the quiet conversations in rooms where no record was ever kept. They burned in the corridors where Agrippina walked, and in the chambers where Claudius read his histories, genuinely absorbed by the past in the way that men who feel uncertain of the present often are, and in the small spaces where decisions were reached that would not be announced until they were already irreversible. She was also, it seems worth noting, a woman of genuine administrative ability, something the ancient sources acknowledge, even when they are doing their best to condemn her for other things. She involved herself in the business of empire in ways that no woman before her had quite managed with such visibility. Receiving ambassadors, sitting near Claudius in contexts that would have been unimaginable for any other woman of her era. Making herself not merely a consort but a presence, a weight, a governing intelligence woven into the fabric of how things were decided and done. And through it all, the sea wind she had known on those island years of exile seemed to follow her, a reminder of what patience costs and what it earns, a whisper beneath the lamp smoke and the noise of the city that everything of any real consequence takes time, that the woman who can wait without becoming small is the woman who eventually does not have to wait at all. The lamps in the palace are burning low now, and the night has settled fully over the Palatine, over the city, over the slow dark water of the river winding through the middle of everything. Agrippina has made her position. She has secured her son's place beside the throne, and in the months and years that are coming, a young man will be given something rare and strange and complicated. The gift of a serious education, the company of a great mind, the chance to become, before power reaches him, something worth becoming. Let that rest with you now. Let the lamplight dim. Let Rome breathe slowly in the dark, and let yourself do the same. The afternoon light in Rome falls differently in autumn, softer and more golden than the hard white blaze of summer. And it is in that kind of light that we find ourselves now, settling into the years when a boy who had already survived so much began, quietly and with great curiosity, to learn what the world might offer him, if the world could be persuaded to be gentle for a little while. Nero was perhaps 11 or 12 years old when Lucius Annaeus Seneca entered his life in any meaningful way, and though the exact shape of those first lessons is lost to us, we can imagine something of the texture of them. The two of them in some colonnaded room of the Palatine, the boy restless and quick-eyed, the man already in middle age, already weathered by exile and return, already carrying within him that particular quality of stillness that comes to those who have thought very carefully about suffering and decided not to be destroyed by it. Seneca had spent years on the island of Corsica, banished there by Claudius in the early years of his reign, and it is said that Agrippina herself had arranged his recall, seeing in this brilliant and polished philosopher exactly the kind of mind she wanted shaping her son. Whether she understood what she was setting in motion is another question entirely, and one we can let rest softly for now. Seneca was a Stoic, or at least he called himself one, which is perhaps not quite the same thing, and he was also a playwright, an essayist, a letter writer of extraordinary elegance, a man who believed with genuine feeling that the examined life was the only life worth living, and that reason, properly cultivated, could be a lamp held against the darkness of any circumstance. He had seen enough darkness to know this was not a simple claim. His essays are full of that knowledge, gentle and honest about how difficult it is to remain calm, how many times the mind must return to its principles before they become anything like second nature. There is something in his writing that reads almost like a private conversation held with himself in the small hours, a voice murmuring steadily beneath the noise of the world, and perhaps that is why it still reaches us so clearly across 20 centuries. What he taught Nero in those early years we can piece together only approximately, drawing on what we know of the Stoic curriculum and on the evidence of Nero's own later interests, but we can say with reasonable confidence that the lessons move through rhetoric and oratory, through the careful construction of argument, through Greek and Latin literature, through history and natural philosophy, and through something harder to name but equally present, a kind of training in how to hold oneself in a room, how to speak and be heard, how to think before speaking, how to find the still center beneath the performance that public life required. These were not merely academic exercises. For a boy who might one day stand before the Senate of Rome, they were as practical as learning to ride. And Nero, by all accounts that reach us, was a willing and genuinely curious student, at least in certain directions. He took to language with real pleasure, and to poetry with something more than pleasure, something closer to need. A story goes that he wrote verses himself from a young age, not merely as exercises, but as a form of private expression, filling in the margins of his thinking with images and rhythms that the prose of daily life could not contain. Whether those early verses were any good we cannot say, since none survive with certainty, but the impulse behind them seems to have been real, and it is one of the threads we will follow through his whole life. This desire to make something beautiful, to arrange sound and meaning into a shape that would last. Music found him early too, or perhaps he found it, and the distinction matters less than the quality of the attachment. He studied the lyre with what his tutors described as unusual dedication, practicing with a persistence that surprised those around him, returning again and again to passages that resisted him, sitting with difficulty rather than retreating from it in the way that powerful children so often learn they can. There was a teacher named Terpnus, it is said, a celebrated lyre player, whose evenings Nero would later seek out as a young man, staying up late into the night listening and then trying for himself. And though this belongs to a slightly later period of his life, the roots of it were laid down here, in these quieter years of formation, in rooms where lamplight pooled on the floor and the city breathed slowly outside the high windows. Philosophy gave him, or tried to give him, something more interior, a framework for understanding what he was, and what the world owed him, and what he owed the world in return. Seneca's stoicism was not a cold or forbidding system. It was in his hands something warmer and more livable than its reputation sometimes suggests, concerned with friendship and kindness as much as with endurance, insisting that the wise person is not the one who feels nothing, but the one who has learned to feel without being entirely consumed. How much of this Nero absorbed in any deep or lasting way is a question that the rest of his story will answer in its own time. But we can at least say that the exposure was genuine, that the conversation between tutor and student was real, and that something of Seneca's quality left a mark, even if the mark was complicated and incomplete. Because Nero was also, even as a child, a performer in some more fundamental sense, someone who felt most alive when inhabiting a gesture, a role, a sound. He was drawn to the theater with a fascination that went beyond mere entertainment, watching the actors with a focused attention that others might have given to military demonstrations or chariot races, and it is said that he was particularly captivated by those moments when the mask of performance became so complete that the person wearing it seemed briefly to disappear, leaving only the character behind. There is something poignant in this for a child who had spent his earliest years learning to read the faces of powerful and dangerous people, learning to present himself in whatever shape would keep him safe. The theater must have seemed to him not an escape from reality, but a kind of clarified version of it, a place where the performances that ordinary life required were acknowledged openly and turned into art. Alongside Seneca, there were other tutors and other influences, as there always are in any education. Greek scholars, teachers of rhetoric, older students who shared his lessons for periods of time, the ambient curriculum of court life itself, which taught its own brutal and valuable lessons about power and precedence and the careful management of impression. Nero moved through all of this with the particular alertness of a child who has learned early that nothing in his world is entirely safe. And perhaps that alertness served him well in these years, sharpening his attention, keeping him present to whatever was happening around him. Britannicus, Claudius's own son, was also being educated in these same years, and the two boys occupied the same world without quite occupying the same space in it, aware of each other as only children in proximity to the same throne can be aware, with a mixture of ordinary boyishness and extraordinary tension that neither of them had chosen and neither could escape. The story goes that Britannicus sometimes called Nero by his birth name, Domitius, rather than the name Agrippina wished him to be known by, and that this small act carried a weight far beyond what children's slights usually carry. But this is a thread for another chapter, and tonight we can let it rest here, barely drawn. What remains from these years when we hold them gently in mind is something surprisingly tender, a boy with a quick mind and a feeling for beauty, sitting in the changing light of an autumn afternoon, learning to shape words and coax music from a strung instrument, absorbing from a remarkable man the idea that the life of the mind might be worth living for its own sake. Whether those lessons would hold, whether they would prove deep enough or strong enough to shape what came later, is the long question that the rest of this story will turn over slowly, like a lamp passed from hand to hand through many rooms. For now, though, the afternoon is quieting. The lamp on the table between tutor and student burns with a small and steady flame, and outside the high window the last of the autumn light is fading from gold to a soft and lengthening gray. And tomorrow Claudius will make a decision that will change the shape of everything this boy has been preparing for, placing him formally and irrevocably onto the path that leads toward an emperor's name. But that is tomorrow, and tonight the lesson is still going gently, and the lamp holds its light, and it is enough for now simply to rest in the quiet of it. The afternoon light was thinning over the Palatine hill, settling into that particular shade of amber that belongs only to Roman winters, when the sun angles low and turns every column of travertine to the color of warm honey, and the shadows pool early in the colonnaded walkways, and servants move quietly through the corridors carrying small clay lamps already lit against the coming dark. It was in such a light, in the year 49 years after the birth of Christ, that something irrevocable was set in motion. Not with trumpets or proclamations, not with the clash of anything violent, but with the quiet scratching of a stylus across a legal document, and the pressing of an imperial seal into warm wax, and the soft final sound of a future closing around a boy of 11 years, like a golden door swinging shut. Claudius, the emperor who had never been meant to rule, who had spent decades as the overlooked uncle, the stammering scholar pushed to the margins of every feast and every conspiracy, sat at the center of all Roman power and made a decision that would echo through centuries. He would adopt Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, the boy the world would come to know as Nero, as his own son. He would give him the name Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus. He would place him in the legal and social architecture of Rome, above Britannicus, his own blood son, his boy of 8 years who bore the name earned by his father's brief military triumph in the province of Britain. The child who had, until that quiet winter afternoon, stood as the natural and expected heir to everything. To understand what this moment meant, it helps to hold in mind how thoroughly Romans understood the world through the language of family. The family, the gens, the household with its ancestral masks displayed in the atrium, and its tutelary spirits tended at the hearth. These were not merely sentimental arrangements, but legal and spiritual architectures through which power, property, obligation, and identity all flowed. Adoption in Rome was not an act of charity, nor primarily an act of affection. It was a political instrument of extraordinary precision. When a Roman of standing adopted a young man, he transferred to him not only a name, but a lineage, a claim, a position in the great web of obligation and honor that constituted Roman public life. And when that adoption was performed by an emperor, it was a statement written in the most durable ink available, not on papyrus, but on the consciousness of the entire Roman world. Claudius had been guided to this decision, as he had been guided to so many decisions, by the woman he had recently married, Agrippina, Nero's mother, whose story deserves its own slow telling, and who had arrived at the emperor's side with the patience and precision of someone who had been planning this particular move for years. She had married her own uncle, a marriage that required a special dispensation that caused murmuring in the Senate and whispers in the markets. And she had done so without visible hesitation, because she understood, with a clarity that few in Rome could match, that proximity to power was the only currency that could not be devalued. Married to the emperor, she became empress, and with her son adopted by the emperor, he became the emperor's son. The logic was simple, the execution was masterful. For Britannicus, the implication settled slowly, the way cold settles into a room when a fire is allowed to die down. He was still present, still the biological son, still treated with the formal courtesies owed to his position, but the gravitational center of succession had shifted. In Rome's understanding of these things, adoption could carry as much weight as blood, sometimes more, given that the great Augustus himself had been the adopted son of Julius Caesar, and had used that adoption as the foundation of his entire claim to lead the world. Britannicus would have understood, perhaps incompletely, perhaps with the confusion proper to an 8-year-old boy navigating a world of adult arrangements, that something had changed, that the shape of his future had been quietly redrawn while he was elsewhere, perhaps in the garden with his tutors, perhaps eating honeycakes in some corner of the palace, unaware that a door had opened for another and closed for him. Nero, for his part, received his new name and his new position with the particular composure that he had been learning, partly through natural temperament, partly through the long tutelage of Seneca, who was already shaping the boy's mind in ways both beautiful and complicated. The new name sat on him like a toga he had not quite grown into, formal and weighty and demanding a kind of performance he was still practicing. He was 11 years old. He had already survived the death of his father, years of his mother's exile, the terrifying volatility of Caligula's court, and the particular loneliness of being a clever, artistic child in a world that watched everything and trusted nothing. He knew, in the way that children raised in imperial households always knew such things, precociously, instinctively, with a wisdom that had been earned at some cost, that his position was valuable, and valuable things in Rome attracted both protection and danger in equal measure. The ceremony of adoption would have been conducted with the proper legal forms, witnessed by the requisite number of citizens, performed with the solemnity that Roman legal ritual demanded. We can imagine the room, though we must hold the image lightly, as imagination and evidence blur at this distance, as one of the palace's more formal receiving spaces, lit perhaps by bronze oil lamps on tall stands, the air carrying the faint sweetness of incense and the cooler note of stone floors, the kind of room where sound behaved differently, where voices carried a slight echo that made even ordinary speech feel consequential. Claudius, who had difficulty with certain sounds, who had spent a lifetime being mocked for the way his body sometimes betrayed him, would have spoken the necessary words with the deliberate care he always brought to formal occasions, when the stammer seemed to ease slightly under the discipline of ritual. Agrippina would have stood nearby with the composed expression of someone watching a plan arrive at precisely the destination she had chosen for it. What is harder to see clearly across these centuries is what Claudius himself believed he was doing. Beyond the immediate political calculations that Agrippina had laid out for him, it is said that he genuinely cared for the boy, that Nero's intelligence and charm, his quick facility with language, his musical ability made him an appealing presence in the palace. Claudius was himself a scholar, a man who had written histories of the Etruscans and the Carthaginians in the long, quiet decades before power found him, who understood the pleasure of a well-ordered mind, and may have recognized something kindred in his new son. Whether affection of any depth existed between them, or whether the relationship remained formal and ceremonial, the sources do not quite agree, and it is perhaps wiser to sit with that uncertainty than to fill it with something tidier than the truth. What the adoption did produce, with a certainty that no uncertainty can soften, was a new order. Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus was now the emperor's eldest son. He was senior to Britannicus. He was, in every formal sense, first in line to inherit the world's most powerful seat. The Senate, which had learned to read imperial arrangements with the careful intention of people whose survival depended on reading them correctly, would have noted this. The Praetorian Guard, whose loyalty was always a negotiation, would have noted it. The people of Rome, who observed the imperial family with the fascinated attention that populations have always given to those who hold power over their lives, would have noted it. Something had been decided. Something had been made official that had previously existed only in the particular private architecture of Agrippina's ambition. And so, in the shortening winter days of that year, the boy who had been born in a house by the sea at Antium, who had been named for his father's old family and then unmade by his father's death, who had traveled through exile and uncertainty and the shadow of Caligula's unpredictable reign, arrived at last at a new name and a new position. He stood on a threshold he had not entirely crossed yet. The emperor still lived. The future was still a thing being written rather than a thing already fixed, but the direction of the writing had been established. And in the evenings, when the lamps were lit across the Palatine hill and the city below settled into its nightly murmur of dogs and distant voices, and the smell of wood smoke rising from 1,000 different hearths, the boy who was now a Caesar could look out from the palace heights and see the extent of what was being prepared for him, not yet his, but no longer entirely belonging to anyone else. Tomorrow, or the day after, or whenever rest has had its fill of you, the city itself will be waiting, its streets and its river and its slow bronze light, ready to be wandered through at whatever pace the night allows. The city breathes before it wakes. Long before the first cartwheel finds the ruts worn into the basalt stones of the Via Sacra, long before the bread sellers have slid their flat loaves from the mouths of their ovens and stacked them on the wide counters of the street-side bakeries, long before a single voice has called across a courtyard, or a single lamp has been trimmed and raised against the retreating dark, Rome is already alive in its own quiet way, settling and sighing like a vast creature that has never truly slept, only rested one eye at a time, while keeping the other turned toward the slow wheel of the stars above the 7 hills. This is the city as it exists in the middle hours of the 1st century, a city of perhaps 1 million souls pressed together into an extraordinary, improbable density of stone and timber and painted plaster, a city that smells always and everywhere of bread and river water and the smoke of 1,000 cooking fires, of the warm animal press of bodies in close streets, of pine resin and garum, that pungent sauce of fermented fish that the Romans love so completely and unreservedly that they pour it over nearly everything they eat, and which hangs in the air of the markets like a second weather, invisible but utterly present, And if you will allow yourself, now, to let your breath slow and your body sink a little deeper into the softness beneath you, you can simply wander through it. This city, this impossible, beautiful, noisy, gentle, ancient world, without urgency, without destination, the way you wander only in the most peaceful of dreams. Dawn comes to Rome not as a single thing, but as a gradual negotiation between the dark and the light, the hills to the east catching the first pale gray suggestion of day, while the valleys between them remain pooled in shadow, and the Tiber, always the Tiber, receiving the changing sky on its broad, unhurried surface, with that particular quality of brown gold water that seems to hold light differently than any other river. Thickly, warmly, the way old bronze holds the sun, giving it back slowly and in its own time. The river does not rush. It has been here longer than the city, longer than the name Rome, longer than any story anyone can tell about this place, and it moves with the patience of something that knows it will outlast everything built along its banks. The first sounds of the waking city are the sounds of the river workers, the men who pull the flat-bottomed boats loaded with amphorae of oil and wine and grain from the port at Ostia, upstream through the brown water with the easy practiced rhythm of men who have done this every day of their working lives. Their poles finding the riverbed with a soft, repeated thud that carries surprisingly far across the water. Warehouses line the western bank of the Tiber, great rectangular brick buildings called Aurea. And in the blue hour before full light, the dock workers have already begun the slow human chain of unloading, amphora by amphora, sack by sack. The commerce of an empire, arriving in its center, one careful armful at a time. But the city proper, the city of columns and temples, and the enormous living neighborhood blocks called insulae that rise 4 and 5 stories above the narrow streets, the city does not truly open its eyes until the sun has cleared the Esquiline hill and sent its light slanting down through the gaps between buildings in long, warm columns that turn the morning dust into something almost beautiful, almost golden, the moats drifting with a slowness that seems to contradict the growing noise below, where now the streets are filling with the particular purposeful chaos of a Roman market day. The markets of Rome are everywhere and nowhere, which is to say that there are formal market spaces, the great open forums with their colonnaded halls and the stalls arranged in orderly rows, but the real commerce of the city seeps out from those centers and runs through every street and alley, so that there is no clear border between the market and everything else, no moment when you can say that here the buying and selling stops and ordinary life begins. A street corner holds a man selling hot chickpeas from a clay pot set over a small brazier, the steam rising from it in the cool morning air, and the chickpeas cost almost nothing and are carried away in a fold of cloth and eaten while walking, because walking and eating are the same activity in Rome. They happen simultaneously, they have always happened simultaneously, and the Romans see nothing remarkable in this. Further along, a fuller's workshop opens directly onto the pavement, its workers already treading the soaking cloth in great vats of water, mixed with materials too humble and too Roman to linger over, and the sound of their work, the rhythmic splashing and the low-sung work song that one of the younger workers has started, carries out into the street and mingles there with the sound of a coppersmith's hammer from the workshop opposite, and the two sounds together create an accidental music, overlapping and separating like voices in a conversation neither party knows they are having. The bathhouses, the thermae, and the smaller balneae tucked into almost every neighborhood of the city do not reach their full life until midday, when the work of the morning has been set down and the great democratic ritual of Roman cleanliness begins. There is something deeply and genuinely peaceful about the bathhouse in the quiet hour just before it fills, when the water in the heated pools lies perfectly still and the steam rises from it in slow uncoiling columns toward the high vaulted ceilings, where the light enters through small round windows and falls in soft diffuse circles on the wet mosaicked floors, and the whole space smells of warm stone and clean water and the faint sweetness of the cedar oil that the attendants use on the wooden benches. The mosaics beneath your feet might show fish, those patient tessellated fish in blue and green and amber glass, their tails forever mid-flick, their eyes forever calm, swimming in floors that will never be water, and yet somehow always suggesting water, always carrying the memory of the river the stone was pulled from. By mid-afternoon, the bathhouse is crowded and warm and very loud, because the Romans do not bathe in silence. They bathe the way they do everything else, with great sociable enthusiasm, talking and arguing and occasionally reciting poetry to anyone willing to listen, while the bath slaves move quietly between the bodies with their bronze strigils, scraping the oil and sweat from shoulders and arms, with the practiced efficiency of people who have learned to be invisible in plain sight. And when the bathers finally emerge back into the streets, their skin pink and warm, blinking a little in the afternoon light, the city has shifted again into its late-day register, slower and more golden, the shadows of the columns stretching long across the forum stones, the light on the Tiber going from gold to copper to a deep warm red as the sun descends toward the Janiculum Hill on the western bank. The food shops and taverns, the Popinae and Thermopolia with their L-shaped counters and their sunken ceramic vessels keeping the day's food warm, fill in the early evening with the particular contentment of working people who have set down their tools and picked up a cup of wine, the wine mixed with water in the Roman way, sensible and sustaining, not a thing for forgetting but a thing for easing the transition between the work self and the rest self. And the low hum of conversation in these places is one of the most human sounds the ancient world contains. Ordinary people discussing ordinary things, the price of grain, the chariot race results, the neighbor's noisy dog, the same conversations that happen everywhere and in every age, endlessly, comfortingly, the same. And then slowly the city dims. The torches are lit at the corners where wealthy households have paid for their upkeep, small orange flames that shift in the warm evening wind coming off the Tiber, and the river itself goes dark, reflecting only the stars and the lights of the bridges, those beautiful stone bridges that carry the city across itself, their arches reflected in the moving water below as perfect shimmering ovals that tremble and reform and tremble again with the patient rhythm of a river that has time for everything. This is the city as it was, as it breathed and smelled and sounded in those first-century nights, the torchlight finding the water, and the water holding the light gently in its current, carrying it slowly downstream toward the sea. And somewhere on the Palatine hill, in the great spread of palace rooms above all of this beautiful ordinary life, a young man raised in exile and uncertainty, and his mother's fierce, relentless ambition, is about to come into his own extraordinary power, the story of which we will follow together, when you are rested, and the night has done its quiet work. The lamps were still burning when the news moved through Rome. It moved the way all such news moves in a city that never fully sleeps, not as a shout or a proclamation, but as a ripple. A whisper passed between the vigiles keeping their posts in the cold October dark, between the bakers already at their ovens before the sun had thought to rise, between the freedmen and the slaves and the senators who lay in their beds and felt, even before the messenger arrived, that something in the texture of the night had changed. Claudius was dead. The palace on the Palatine hill had exhaled its longest breath, and into the stillness that followed, a boy of 16 years had stepped forward to become the master of the known world. The morning that Nero emerged to meet the Praetorian Guard was the morning of the 13th day of October, in the year that Rome counted as the 807th since its founding, what we might reckon as the 54th year of the Common Era. The air would have carried that particular quality that October mornings carry in the south, cool and faintly mineral, with the smell of stone still releasing the warmth it had gathered from the previous day's sun. Torches burned at the gates of the camp where the Praetorians assembled, and their light fell in long amber columns across the cobblestones, rippling where the air moved, steadying where it did not. Nero stood before these soldiers in his toga, his face young enough that the morning light found no lines to rest in. His voice, that voice he had spent so many hours training and tending, measured and clear as he addressed the men who would decide in those first critical hours whether an emperor lived or died. He promised them, it is recorded, a donative, a gift of money, a tradition as old as the Praetorian Guard itself, a kind of spoken contract between the emperor's body and the men sworn to protect it. They responded with their acclamation. The thing was done. The boy was emperor. And then he was carried on a litter through streets that were beginning to fill with the ordinary sounds of ordinary Roman morning. The creak of cartwheels, the cry of vendors, the distant complaint of a donkey somewhere in the Subura, and somewhere above all of it, perhaps, the smell of bread, always the smell of bread, which is the smell of Rome as surely as lamp oil, and river water, and warm stone. He would have passed beneath the shadows of buildings he had known all his young life, buildings that now were, in some formal and enormous sense, his. The city was his. The legions on the Rhine and the Danube and in the deserts of the east were his. The grain ships moving across the Mediterranean were his. All of it, that vast breathing empire, had settled onto the narrow shoulders of a boy who had spent his adolescence studying Stoic philosophy and learning to play the cithara. What followed in those first years is remembered by ancient writers with something close to warmth, which is itself a remarkable thing when you consider how the story would eventually turn. Tacitus, who was not a man given to easy praise of emperors, described the early reign of Nero in terms that suggested something genuinely hopeful had been possible. The Senate found itself consulted, rather than merely informed. Decisions that had been made in whispers behind closed doors were offered, at least in form, to the deliberative bodies of Rome. Seneca, who had been Nero's tutor through all those years of careful education, and who now stood at the young emperor's side as an advisor, composed the speech that Nero delivered to the Senate upon his accession. And it was a speech that promised, among other things, that the young emperor would not be his stepfather Claudius, would not allow the freedmen of the palace to accumulate the authority that proper magistrates ought to hold, would not conduct trials behind closed doors. It was, by any measure, a gracious speech, and it was received with what seems to have been genuine relief. Beside Seneca stood Sextus Afranius Burrus, the prefect of the Praetorian Guard, man of soldierly plainness and reported integrity, whose influence on the young emperor pulled in directions complementary to Seneca's own. Where Seneca shaped the mind, Burrus steadied the will. Where Seneca offered the long view of philosophy, Burrus offered the practical clarity of a man who had spent his life in service and knew what institutions required to function. Together, the two of them formed something like a careful architecture around the young emperor, not constraining him, or not visibly so, but offering a structure within which a boy might learn, slowly, what it meant to hold such power without being consumed by it. And for a time, a genuinely remarkable time, it seemed to work. The ancient sources speak of what they called a quinquennium, a 5-year period in which the administration of the empire proceeded with unusual competence and relative fairness. Provinces were governed, laws were applied, the vast machinery of Roman administration, that intricate system of governors and procurators and tax collectors and judges that reached from the misty edge of Britannia to the hot silence of the Egyptian desert, turned with something close to smoothness. Nero signed documents, he received ambassadors, he sat in judgment, and the judgments were, for a while, considered just. He is said to have wept in those early days when he was first required to sign an execution order. The story may be embellished, may carry the weight of later writers who needed a moment to mark the distance between what Nero was and what he would become. But it is a story that has endured, and there is something in it worth resting with for a moment, the image of a young man confronting, perhaps for the first time with full weight, what absolute power actually required, not only glory and ceremony in the warmth of public acclamation, but this too, the pen, the name, the silence after. He was not in these years only a student of governance. He was still very much himself, curious, artistic, drawn toward performance in ways that his advisors found, it is suggested, mildly alarming. He gathered around him musicians and poets and performers of every kind, filling the evening hours of the palace with sounds that the more traditional members of Roman society found unseemly in a Caesar. But for now, this was a private indulgence, kept within walls, expressed among friends. For now, the public face of Nero was composed and reasonable, the face that Seneca had helped to construct, thoughtful, measured, the face of a young ruler who might, with time, become something genuinely good. The city itself seemed to breathe more easily. In the markets of the Esquiline and the Aventine, in the cookshops along the Tiber's banks, in the bathhouses where men soaped in hot water and spoke freely, in the way that men in bathhouses always have, there was something that might cautiously be called optimism. The monster Caligula was long gone. Claudius, well-meaning but erratic and subject to the influence of those around him, was gone too. Here was youth, actual youth, an emperor who had not yet grown old enough to be corrupted, or so the hope went. And hope is a thing that Romans, like all people, were perfectly capable of entertaining, even when experience counseled otherwise. The lamps that burned in the palace on those early evenings burned perhaps with something like steadiness. The oil was good, the wicks were well trimmed. The light fell across the faces of advisors at work, across the writing tables where correspondence from the provinces accumulated, across the young emperor himself, bent over some text or some instrument, his mind moving in directions that might lead anywhere at all. The empire was vast, and the night was long, and the flame held. In the rooms beyond his own, in other parts of that great labyrinthine palace, other lamps were burning too. Other minds were moving. The quiet that surrounded Nero's early reign was real, but it was not, perhaps, as wide as it seemed. And in those other rooms, in those other circles of lamplight, patience was a thing being practiced with great deliberate care. But that is a story that can wait until morning has passed and the next evening has come gently down. For now, the young emperor sleeps, and the city sleeps around him, and the fires of the Palatine burn low and warm, and there is nothing yet to fear in the dark. The lamps were already burning low on the Palatine hill when the trouble between them truly began to deepen. It is a quiet hour to enter, this particular stretch of Nero's early reign, and yet it is perhaps the most important one, because what happened in the corridor conversations and the curtained dining rooms of the imperial palace shaped everything that came after. Not in the way of sudden storms or violent ruptures, not yet, but in the way of water finding the hairline cracks in old stone, patient and persistent and absolutely inevitable. The tension between a mother and her emperor son moved slowly at first, like smoke gathering near the ceiling before anyone thinks to open a window, and it is worth settling into that slowness, feeling the particular texture of those gilded rooms, to understand how it all accumulated. Agrippina the Younger was, by almost any measure, one of the most remarkable people in the Roman world of her age. She had survived exile and disgrace and the casual brutality of life near the center of imperial power. She had maneuvered her way back from nothing, had placed her son upon the most powerful throne in the known world, and she had done so with a kind of cold, luminous intelligence that contemporaries found simultaneously admirable and deeply unsettling. The ancient sources, Tacitus most vividly among them, describe her as a woman who wanted not merely influence, but something closer to partnership in rule, perhaps something even beyond that. It is said she sometimes appeared at official audiences positioned so that she might sit beside Nero, or even share his elevated place, in a way that would have made her role unmistakably visible to every ambassador and dignitary present. This was not an accident. Nothing Agrippina did was an accident. In those first years after Nero's accession, the arrangement had a kind of functioning equilibrium to it. Seneca and Burrus managed the practical business of governance. Nero performed the ceremonial and public role of emperor with what most accounts suggest was genuine charm and a disarming willingness to be generous. And Agrippina presided over everything, like the moon presides over a dark garden, exerting a pull that was felt everywhere even when she was not directly visible. Her face appeared on coins alongside her son's in those early months, which was itself an extraordinary thing, a living woman, not deified, not a goddess by official proclamation, but simply a mother, rendered in silver alongside the profile of the emperor. The message was not subtle, and it was not meant to be. But Nero was 16 when he came to the throne, and then he was 17, and then 18, and the years of a young man are not the same years of a boy who can be guided without resistance. He had been formed, yes, by Seneca's careful teaching, by years of watching and listening and being shaped. But he had also been formed by something else entirely, by an appetite for beauty and sensation, and the particular freedom that an emperor discovers is available to him once he begins to look around and realize that no one in the room will tell him no. He began to find that his own desires, his love of music and performance, his wandering attention toward the pleasures of the city, his growing attachment to a young woman named Ate, who was inconveniently a freedwoman rather than anyone Agrippina would have chosen, were not things his mother could easily accommodate within her vision of what his reign should be. Acte is a soft and somewhat melancholy figure in the historical record, and there is something gentle about the way she appears in the story of these years, a young woman who, by the accounts of the time, genuinely cared for Nero in a way that was uncomplicated by political calculation, which was, in the world of the Palatine, almost miraculous. Agrippina disapproved of her with a vehemence that was entirely predictable. A freedwoman was not a suitable companion for the emperor. A freedwoman offered Nero nothing in the way of alliance or strategic advantage. And more than that, perhaps, a freedwoman was not someone Agrippina could control, not someone who came with family ties and obligations that could be pressed upon and leveraged. Acte belonged only to herself and to whatever affection she and Nero shared, and that made her, in Agrippina's accounting, simply dangerous. The story goes that Agrippina's opposition to the relationship drove Nero closer to it rather than away, which is the kind of thing that is probably true, because it is the kind of thing that is always true about young men and their mothers, and the particular alchemy of prohibition. Seneca and Burrus, the ancient sources suggest, chose a careful pragmatism in this matter, deciding that a harmless private attachment was preferable to other entertainments Nero might seek, and that opposing Agrippina in this small thing was a way of keeping her from accumulating too much authority over even the smallest details of Nero's personal life. It is a very human moment in what is otherwise a very grand political story, these three powerful men and one formidable woman negotiating essentially over who the emperor was allowed to love. But the disagreements between Agrippina and her son were not only personal, they were institutional, embedded in the very machinery of how the empire was run. There were financial disputes, it is recorded, over the treasury and the degree to which Agrippina expected to have a hand in how imperial resources were distributed. There were tensions over appointments, over which men rose and which men fell, over the management of the Praetorian Guard and the vast web of patronage that held Roman society in its shape. Agrippina had been instrumental in the death of Claudius's son, Britannicus's prospects, had engineered the adoption that placed Nero above him, and she had done all of that with the understanding, or so it seems from the texture of events that followed, that she was not stepping aside afterward to become merely a dignified figure in the background. She intended to remain at the center. And here is where something shifted, quietly but irrevocably in the household, because Nero, guided in this by Seneca and Burrus, and perhaps also by something simply instinctive in his own nature, began to push back, not loudly, not with proclamations or confrontations in public, but in the accumulated small decisions of daily governance. Appointments Agrippina wanted blocked, requests she made redirected, or quietly left unaddressed. The coins that had shown her face beside his were replaced with new issues showing only his own profile. These were not accidents either, and Agrippina would have read them with the same precise attention she brought to everything. She was being diminished, incrementally and deliberately, and by the son she had made an emperor. The ancient sources describe scenes between them that carry a strange domestic quality, even in their extremity. Tacitus records moments of direct confrontation, words that passed between mother and son that were sharp enough to leave marks. It is said that Agrippina, in her frustration, threatened at various points to transfer her support to Britannicus, Claudius's natural son who still lived, and who still, in some quarters, retained a quiet legitimacy as the emperor's son by blood. Whether she meant this as a genuine political threat, or as a mother's desperate attempt to reassert some leverage over a child who was slipping beyond her reach, it is impossible now to say with certainty. But Nero heard it, and the people around Nero heard it, and in the particular atmosphere of imperial Rome where the distance between a spoken threat and a real one was always vanishingly small, it could not be unheard. There is a melancholy in all of this that deserves a moment of quiet attention before we move on. Because Agrippina had given everything she had to place her son where he was. She had endured exile on a barren island, had returned with nothing but her name and her intelligence, had navigated the treacherous currents of Claudius's court, had watched and planned and maneuvered for years, and the thing she had built, the magnificent and dangerous thing she had devoted herself to constructing, was now looking back at her with its own set of eyes, making its own set of calculations. Whatever she had imagined when she first held her infant son in the city of Antium, and looked at him with those ancient considering eyes, it is unlikely she had imagined this. The lamps of the palace burned on through those years, casting their amber warmth over rooms, where the conversations were careful, and the silences were meaningful, and the love between a mother and her son was becoming indistinguishable, in the end, from something altogether more dangerous. Outside, the city went on with its beautiful, oblivious life, the smell of bread and river water drifting up through the evening, while inside the palace walls, something that could not be undone continued quietly to happen. The next step in this particular story belongs to the water, to the Bay of Naples, and to a night that neither of them would survive unchanged. But for now, let all of that rest where it belongs, somewhere ahead in the dark, not yet arrived, and let yourself settle into the warm and quiet air of this moment, breathing slowly, letting the lamplight fade. The night had already settled over the Bay of Naples like a long exhalation, the water darkening from deep blue to something closer to pewter, then to a quiet, breathing black, and somewhere out on that wide and indifferent sea, a lamp was moving, small and trembling, carried on a boat that had left the shore at Baiae not long before, and those who watched from the hillsides might have thought it a peaceful thing, that little light rocking gently on the swell, a lantern on an evening vessel, returning someone home across the water. But the story of that night, the night that history would come to mark with such heaviness, is not a simple one, and it does not yield easily to simple telling. And perhaps that is fitting, because nothing in the life of Nero and Agrippina was ever quite what it appeared on the surface. Every gesture between them layered beneath other gestures, every word carrying the weight of other words unsaid, and so it seems right that the events surrounding the death of Agrippina the Younger should remain even after 2,000 years, clouded with uncertainty, wrapped in the particular darkness of that Campanian night, illuminated only in fragments and glimpses, the way a distant lamp illuminates only itself and nothing around it. What we know or what the ancient sources tell us, though they do not always agree with one another and they each carry their own angles of sympathy and grievance, is something like this. In the year 62, though the story goes that the exact timing was tangled in earlier plotting, Nero invited his mother to join him at Baiae, on the lovely, languid shore of the bay, where wealthy Romans built their villas among lemon trees and terraced gardens that spilled toward the water, where the air smelled of salt and the particular sweetness of flowers that bloom in places too warm for frost. Agrippina came, it is said, and there was a banquet, as there were always banquets in that world, long and lamplit and accompanied by the slow music of flutes and the pouring of wine into shallow cups of Alexandrian glass. Whether she suspected anything as she sat at her son's table that evening is something no one can say with certainty. She had lived her entire life in proximity to danger, had moved through the court of Caligula like a woman crossing a river on stones that might at any moment shift beneath her feet, had endured exile and return, had maneuvered with patience and extraordinary skill through the reign of Claudius, had seen what happened to those who relaxed their vigilance even for a single season. She was not a woman who easily forgot that the world was dangerous. And yet the ancient writers suggest that the mood of the banquet was a warm one, that Nero was attentive, even affectionate, that she left in what appeared to be a spirit of reconciliation, boarding the boat that had been provided for her return across the bay to her own villa at Bauli. The boat, as the story goes, had been interfered with. The accounts differ in their details, as they so often do when the event in question was deeply inconvenient to those who survived it. But there is a persistent tradition that the vessel had been constructed or modified in such a way that it might be caused to collapse, that the canopy over the stern was weighted and could be released, that what was intended was something that might look like an accident, the kind of misfortune that even the Bay of Naples, gentle as it usually was, might plausibly produce on an unlucky night. And there are accounts of the canopy falling, of water entering the vessel, of a sudden confusion in the dark, of passengers tumbling into the sea, and yet Agrippina, the story tells us, survived. It is said that she was a strong swimmer, or that she was simply possessed of that extraordinary will that had carried her through every other catastrophe of her life, and that she reached the shore, or was pulled from the water, and made her way to her villa at Bauli, understanding now with absolute clarity what had happened and what was likely to happen next. She is said to have sent a message to Nero informing him that she had survived a fortunate accident, that she was safe and resting, perhaps trying to buy herself a little time, perhaps genuinely uncertain of what else to say, perhaps still, even then, hoping that some other story might yet be written. It could not. The men who came to her villa that night were soldiers, and though the ancient accounts differ on small details, how many there were, exactly what was said in those final moments, whether she spoke or whether she was silent, they converge on the essential shape of what occurred, which was that Agrippina the Younger, daughter of Germanicus, the most powerful woman in the Roman world for the better part of 2 decades, died in her own room at Bauli, by the edge of the sea whose lamp she had been riding home across only hours before. Nero, when he received word that it was done, is said by Tacitus to have looked at her body and made some remark about its beauty, though whether this detail is true or an embellishment added by a writer who understood the dark ironies of that family's history, one cannot say. What is more certain is the account of the days that followed, which describe a man who was visibly disturbed, who struggled to present a composed face to the Senate and to the city, who sent messages explaining that Agrippina had been discovered plotting against his life, and that her death had therefore been a matter of necessity, a story the Senate accepted and formally endorsed, as the Senate in those years tended to accept and formally endorse whatever the emperor required of them. But the acceptance of a story is not the same as the settling of a conscience, and the ancient writers, Tacitus above all, are very interested in what they describe as Nero's inability to rest easily after his mother's death, his susceptibility to bad dreams, his restlessness in the palace, his desire to leave Rome and move through the countryside as though the very rooms where he had grown up in her shadow had become uncomfortable to him. There is a tradition, perhaps embellished, perhaps not, that he began to feel haunted, that the particular quality of lamplight in certain rooms reminded him of her, that he was never again entirely easy in the spaces they had shared. It is worth sitting with this for a moment. The particular architecture of guilt and ambition and fear that produced the events of that night is not something that can be reduced to a simple verdict delivered from a comfortable distance of 2,000 years, but simply to note that Agrippina had been, in her complicated and often frightening way, the force that had made Nero. She had plotted for him and schemed for him and sacrificed for him and loved him and controlled him and suffocated him and elevated him. And now she was gone, and the world that remained was one in which he had to discover, perhaps for the first time, what he actually was when she was not present to tell him, to shape him, to need something from him. He was 21 years old. He was the Emperor of Rome. He was standing. In whatever interior sense, a young man stands in the aftermath of an irreversible act, beside an open door, and the room on the other side of it was one he had never entered before. And whatever light there was came from uncertain sources, flickering in the way that lamps flicker when the oil is uncertain, or when a door is not quite closed against the night wind coming up from the sea. The Bay of Naples in the aftermath, the ancient writers tell us, returned to its own concerns with the serene indifference of places that have seen too much history to be altered by any single night's events. The fishing boats went out in the morning as they always did. The villas on the hillsides resumed their quiet rhythms of household and garden, and the slow pleasure of afternoons spent in view of the water. The sea continued its old conversation with the shore, the sound of it steady and salt-smelling and patient, the same sound it had made long before any of these people were born, and the same sound it would make long after all of them were gone. And in Rome, a young emperor turned his attention, as young emperors will, toward the things that had always offered him solace and pleasure, and the sensation of being for a little while entirely himself, rather than someone else's instrument, or heir, or creation. He turned toward music and toward poetry, and toward the kind of company that did not ask difficult questions, toward the lamplit pleasures of a life that was, despite everything, still very young, still full of possibility, still illuminated by something that had not yet quite dimmed. The next chapter of his story belongs to that light, to the warmth of what he loved and what he made, and it begins, as all such chapters do, in the quiet hour when the lamps are freshly trimmed and the evening is just beginning to breathe. The lamps were burning late across the Palatine hill, as they so often did in those years, their small orange flames trembling in the corridors of the palace like a scattered constellation brought indoors. And somewhere deep within those gilded rooms, a man was singing. Not performing for a crowd, not rehearsing for an occasion, simply singing, the way a person does when they believe no one is listening, when the voice moves through the body without permission or calculation, rising and falling with something that feels very much like relief. That man was the Emperor of Rome, and for a few hours at least, in the warm amber haze of lamplight and incense smoke, he was nothing more complicated than that. A man with a voice he loved, a lyre he could not put down, and a world he was slowly, quietly rearranging around the shape of his own longing. The years following the death of Agrippina were strange and contradictory years, full of guilt and relief in roughly equal measure, full of the particular restlessness that comes when a great weight is suddenly lifted and the body does not quite know what to do with its own lightness. Nero had spent the earliest part of his reign navigating the immense gravitational pull of his mother's ambitions, and now that pull was gone, and what rushed in to fill the space was art and love and the roar of the circus and the sound of his own voice bouncing back to him from the stone walls of theaters he had built precisely so that it might. It is worth pausing here, in the gentleness of this telling, to understand what music truly meant to him, because it was not a hobby, not an emperor's dilettante pastime taken up to seem interesting at dinner. The ancient sources, even those not kindly disposed toward him, acknowledge that Nero practiced with genuine dedication, submitting himself to the regimens of professional musicians, lying flat on his back with lead weights on his chest to strengthen his breathing, as singers were instructed to do, restricting his diet on the advice of his vocal teachers, taking his lessons with the seriousness of a craftsman who understands that the instrument, in this case his own body, requires maintenance and respect. He studied the lyre with a devotion that his tutors found, the story goes, almost startling in a young man of his position, a position that had never required him to be humble before any teacher about anything. And there was something in that humility, small and genuine as it was, that speaks to what the arts offered him that governance never could. On the stage or in the practice room or in the private hours when he played alone by lamplight, there was a kind of order that the empire could never provide. A musical phrase either resolved or it did not. A line of poetry either scanned correctly or it stumbled. The lyre strings either held their tuning or they drifted, and you simply tightened them and tried again. It was a world of clear cause and consequence, of effort rewarded in direct proportion to its quality. And for a man who had grown up inside the Byzantine cruelties of the imperial family, where nothing was ever what it appeared, and nothing could be trusted, and even love arrived with conditions attached, that clarity must have felt something very close to sanctuary. He raced chariots with the same unguarded earnestness. The Circus Maximus, that long and thunderous bowl of sand and spectacle, was a place where he could be genuinely, uselessly, brilliantly fast, where the horses required his full attention and the crowd required nothing of him except speed, and where the wind moved through everything in long horizontal sweeps, tearing at cloaks and banners and the manes of horses, carrying with it the smell of dust and leather and the sharp animal warmth of creatures pushing themselves to the edge of what they were capable of. He, it is said, genuinely loved his horses, named them, visited them in the stables with the kind of quiet attentiveness a person gives to something they consider a companion rather than a tool. But it was in these same years that Poppaea Sabina came to occupy the center of his life, and she deserves to be settled into this telling with care, because she is so often rendered as a simple villain in the old accounts, a cold and calculating woman who wound herself around the emperor for power and nothing else. And while power was certainly part of it, the picture the ancient sources inadvertently paint is considerably more interesting than that. She was, by all accounts that survive, extraordinarily beautiful, and the writers who disliked her cannot quite stop themselves from recording the fact with a kind of helpless admiration. She was also, the story goes, deeply intelligent, educated in the way that well-born Roman women of her era sometimes were, capable of conversation that moved between politics and philosophy and flattery with an ease that Nero found irresistible. She had been married twice before him, first to a man called Rufrius Crispinus, and then to Marcus Salvius Otho, who was one of Nero's own close companions, which gives you some measure of the tangled intimacy of the imperial social world, where the same small number of people rotated through each other's lives and households and beds with a kind of exhausted inevitability. It is said that when Nero first truly fell for her, he fell completely, with the uncritical totality of someone who has not loved much before and mistakes intensity for permanence. There was still at this time a wife, Octavia, the daughter of Claudius, a quiet and by all accounts blameless young woman who had done nothing wrong except to represent a dynastic arrangement rather than a living desire. Nero's marriage to Octavia had always been more architecture than warmth, a structure built to support succession and legitimacy rather than a home two people had chosen together. Poppaea offered him something different, something that felt chosen rather than inherited, and in the arithmetic of his emotional life that difference was everything. He eventually divorced Octavia, a decision that provoked a visible shudder of public disapproval throughout Rome, where the people had a tenderness for Octavia rooted in a simple and powerful feeling that she had done nothing to deserve her fate, and that she was the daughter of Claudius, whom many still remembered with genuine fondness. There were demonstrations in the streets, the kind of spontaneous, inarticulate outpouring that cities produce when they feel something has been done that is beneath them. But Nero married Poppaea nonetheless, in 62, and for a time, by such accounts as survive, they were genuinely happy, or as close to happiness as either of them was constituted to sustain. She seems to have encouraged his artistic ambitions, or at least not discouraged them, which in the context of those around him was a kind of encouragement in itself. Seneca and Burrus had always regarded his performances with a muted diplomatic unease, understanding that an emperor who sang publicly on the stage was eroding something of the traditional Roman gravity that held the office in a particular kind of regard. But Poppaea did not appear to share that unease, or if she did not show it. And so in her company, Nero moved more freely toward the parts of himself he most wanted to inhabit. He began to perform more publicly during these years, first in Naples, which the story goes he chose because it felt more Greek than Roman, more sympathetic to the performance traditions of the Eastern Mediterranean, less likely to receive a man who sang on stage with the cold disapproval of old Republican values. He performed in competition, submitting himself formally to the judgment of audiences and panels of judges, and it is said that he received his prizes with a sincerity of emotion that onlookers found affecting, that the expression on his face when he held a laurel crown was not the satisfied smile of a man who has arranged his own victory, but something more genuinely moved, more nakedly grateful, the expression of someone who has been told that the thing they love in themselves is real. The lamps burned on through those nights. In the practice rooms and the performance halls and the intimate private spaces where a man and a woman talked and laughed and made the small daily negotiations of a shared life. The flame of the oil lamp is a patient, democratic thing, indifferent to whether it illuminates an emperor or a shepherd, throwing its warmth equally on joy and on sorrow, on the beginning of something and on the first quiet signs of its unraveling. And the city beyond the palace, the great breathing city of Rome with all its million lives and its ancient bones and its endless appetite, was about to offer them both something none of them had imagined, a darkness larger than any single lamp could hold, a heat entirely different from the warmth of music and love, rising somewhere in the direction of the Circus Maximus on a hot summer night in the year that history would not forget. The night had been warm for the middle of summer, warm in the way that Rome in July could be. The heat of the day stored up in the stones of a million walls, released slowly, reluctantly, into the dark hours, so that even long past midnight, the air in the low-lying quarters of the city held a close and breathless quality, like the air inside a kiln that has been shut down but not yet cooled. The Circus Maximus stood at the edge of the valley between the Aventine and Palatine hills, that great long oval of wooden stalls and vendors' shops pressed close against the ancient stone, and it was somewhere near that district, in the shops and warehouses that crowded its southeastern end, that the fire began. It is said the 19th of July, in the year that we count as 64 years after the birth of Christ, though in those days the Romans would have named it by the consuls who held office that year, anchoring time not in numbers but in names, in the faces of men. The fire, when it began, was not yet a catastrophe. Fires in the city were common, nearly ordinary, the way that any city built of timber and thatch and resin-soaked wood, any city where lamps burned through every night in 1,000 narrow rooms, any city where cooking fires were never wholly extinguished, where the air in summer was always dry and the alleys always close, the way that such a city always carries within itself the possibility of flame. But this fire did not stop. It moved through the shops along the circus the way that wind moves through dry grass, gathering as it went, pulling the heat of itself upward into drafts that bent back down and kissed new surfaces alight. And by the time the bucket chains were formed and the vigils had run to their stations, the fire had already eaten its way into the neighboring insulae, those tall, crowded apartment blocks where thousands of the city's poorest and most numerous inhabitants slept their summer sleep in rooms barely wider than an arm's span, where the wooden floors and ceilings were layered one atop the other like pages in a book, each one ready to pass the flame upward to the next. People woke to orange light in their windows and the sound that fire makes when it is truly large. Not the cheerful crackle of a hearthside, but something deeper, something that has a voice almost like wind, a sustained and rushing exhalation, as though the city itself were breathing out at last, after holding a breath for a very long time. The streets of Rome at night in summer were already warm with bodies, with the traffic that was by law forbidden in the daylight hours, the carts and mules and wagons of the merchants rattling over the paving stones, the voices of negotiators and laborers, the low river smell that rose from the Tiber when the breeze shifted. Into all of this the fire spilled, and the streets that had been crowded with commerce became crowded with flight. It is written in the account of Tacitus, who was a young boy somewhere in the empire at the time, and who gathered his testimony from those who had seen it, that the fire fed on the narrow-angled streets, that the random and organic plan of Rome, the city that had grown without design over 7 centuries, offered the flames a labyrinth of passages and hidden corners, no wide boulevards to serve as fire breaks, no rational grid to interrupt the burning. The fire jumped from roof to roof. It descended into the valleys between hills and climbed again. It found its way along the Celian hill and pressed toward the Palatine, toward the Esquiline, toward the ancient heart of the city where the oldest temples stood. For 6 days and 7 nights, it is said, the fire burned before it was brought under any kind of control. And then, just when the exhausted vigiles and the improvised teams of slaves and soldiers believed it might at last be dying, a second fire broke out in a different quarter, in the property of a man named Tigellinus, who was then the prefect of the Praetorian Guard and one of the emperor's most trusted companions. A coincidence of location that would feed the rumors for generations. The second fire burned for 3 more days. When it was finally over, 3 of Rome's 14 districts had been utterly consumed, leaving nothing but rubble and the ghost shapes of walls. 4 more districts survived only in pieces, their buildings half-standing, their contents scattered, their inhabitants displaced. Only 4 of the 14 regions emerged comparatively unscathed. Nero, at the time the fire began, was at Antium, the seaside town on the coast south of Rome where he had been born, where he maintained a villa and where he had retreated in the heat of summer. The story goes that he returned to the city when the fire was spreading toward the Palatine and toward the Domus Transitoria, his own palace that connected the Palatine and Esquiline hills, and that he organized relief efforts with genuine energy, opening the Campus Martius and the great public gardens of Agrippa to the displaced and homeless, bringing in food from the surrounding towns, reducing the price of grain. Whether this generosity was sincere or calculated, or some mixture of both, that even Nero himself might not have been able to disentangle, it is impossible now to say. What was said almost immediately by those who wished him ill, was that he had not returned at all, that he had stood on a high tower in Antium and watched the distant glow of Rome burning, and that he had sung, dressed in theatrical costume, accompanying himself on the lyre, performing a composition of his own about the fall of Troy, finding in the ruin of his city a subject worthy of his art. This story, with all its gorgeous and terrible imagery, its emperor as performer, its callousness dressed in culture, became one of the most enduring images that history would carry forward from his reign. Whether it is true is another matter entirely. Tacitus himself, who was no admirer of Nero, recorded it cautiously. The story he suggests was told. He does not say it was witnessed. And then there was the question of blame. The city needed an explanation, not only a practical one but a moral one, the kind of explanation that gives grief and rage a place to go. Nero needed one too. For whatever his feelings in the matter, his reign would be measured against the ruin. And so it is recorded that the blame was directed at a group of people, known to some in the city as Christians, followers of a Jewish teacher who had been executed in Judea a generation before, and whose small and scattered communities were regarded in Rome with a mixture of suspicion and contempt. Thought strange for their refusals, their exclusive allegiances, their unwillingness to participate in the ordinary civic religious life that surrounded them. Whether any member of any such community actually started the fire seems at this distance deeply unlikely. The fire was almost certainly an accident, born in the cramped and combustible conditions that any dry summer and any densely built quarter would have made inevitable. But the community was available, was already marked by suspicion, had few defenders, and so they became the answer to the question of blame. The account of Tacitus describes their punishment with a measure of discomfort even from that pen, noting that while Nero's cruelty might have deserved no sympathy, it was difficult not to feel some for those who suffered it. What came after the fire was in some ways stranger than the fire itself, stranger in its quietness, in its slow and almost dreamlike quality. The city was cleared. The rubble was carried away by barge on the Tiber, loaded at the banks and shipped downstream to the marshes, the old stone and ash of Rome being quietly absorbed into the mud of the estuary. New streets were laid out, wider than before, with porticos and setbacks required by law, the fire having offered the terrible gift of a fresh start for the city's plan. Buildings were required to be a certain height, to incorporate fireproof materials where possible, to have access to water. The Romans rebuilt with the pragmatic energy of a people who had always believed, perhaps above all else, in continuity, in the persistence of the city as an idea, if not always as a structure. Altars and temples that had survived even in fragmentary form were rebuilt first, their sacred fires rekindled from coals that had been carried through the smoke and preserved, little carried flames that had never gone out, tended through the chaos, because some things must be tended through any chaos. And Nero, moving through the ruins and the reconstruction, was already thinking about something else, something that would rise where the ash had fallen, something so large and so strange and so utterly unlike anything the city had known before, that it would take the breath from those who first walked through it. The plans were forming, the land was clearing, and in the space that the fire had opened, by accident or by design or by the inscrutable intersection of the two, a new thing was becoming possible. For now the city rested in its ash, and the Tiber moved slowly past the ruins as it had always moved, its water carrying the reflection of whatever light the sky offered, indifferent and patient and very old, carrying everything gently downstream toward the sea. The ash had barely cooled when the surveyor's rods went out across the blackened earth. You can almost picture it, if you let yourself drift into that peculiar haze between waking and sleep. The early morning light falling pale and thin across the hills of Rome, the smoke still rising in pale threads from timbers that had burned for 9 days. And amid all that gray and ruin, the quiet scratch of a stylus on wax, the careful laying out of lines, the first whispered arithmetic of something extraordinary. Something that had never been built before, and perhaps has never truly been built since. Rome was still warm with its own catastrophe, and yet already the emperor's dream was pressing up through the cinders like a strange and improbable flower. It was called the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, and whatever one chooses to believe about the fire that preceded it, the story goes that some believe Nero himself had wished for this blank canvas, though many historians since have found that story difficult to untangle from rumor and from the particular bitterness of those who despised him. Whatever one thinks of its origins, the structure itself was something the ancient world had not imagined could belong to a single man. Not a palace exactly, though it contained apartments and galleries and halls of audience stretching further than the eye could easily follow. Something closer to a world, a folded and gilded version of the natural landscape, pressed behind walls and ceilings and set to flicker in lamplight. The grounds alone, and here the senses truly must be allowed to slow down and wander. The grounds alone are said to have covered something near to 300 acres across the very heart of Rome, between the Esquiline and the Caelian hills, across the valley that would one day hold the Colosseum. Nero's architects laid out a landscape that was part garden, part lake, part forest, part theater of sky. There were vineyards, so the accounts tell us, where the soil had been specially prepared. There were pastures where animals moved at a gentle distance. There was a lake, artificial and vast, made to recall the sea itself, glittering in the Roman afternoons with a light that must have seemed almost miraculous to those who had only days before been breathing smoke. The lake, that lamp of water at the heart of everything. It sat there in the middle of the new estate like a held breath, like a mirror set into the earth to catch the clouds and hold them still. Around its edges, according to those who described it afterward, the plantings were made to suggest the countryside outside the city. Willows and reeds and the kind of soft, bending grasses that line rivers in the slower parts of Italy. Colonnades stretched along its shores, small pavilions offered shade, and the whole arrangement was designed to give the impression that one had stepped, improbably, out of the city altogether. That Rome, with its noise and its crowds and its ceaseless wanting, had simply dissolved and left behind only this: still water, open sky, the sound of birds. The architects were named Severus and Celer, and it is said they were men of extraordinary imagination, not merely engineers, though their engineering was prodigious, but something closer to what we might now call visionaries. They understood that Nero's ambitions for this place were not architectural in the conventional sense. He did not want simply a large house. He wanted to make of the built world something that could rival nature itself, could fold it in, domesticate it, make it perform. And so the two men designed rooms that had never existed before. A great rotating dining hall, or so the ancient accounts insist. A ceiling made to turn slowly, continuously day and night, reflecting the movement of the celestial sphere, the planets in their patient circuits, rendered in the gilded plasterwork above the heads of the diners below. Whether such a mechanism truly existed, or how it worked if it did, remains one of those quiet pleasures of ancient history, a thing just beyond the edge of certainty, shimmering there like lamplight on water, neither confirmed nor dismissed. The walls of the interior rooms were covered in frescoes of such lightness and intricacy that later ages, finding them buried beneath the monuments built over Nero's estate, would call them grotesque, works from the caves, found by Renaissance painters who lowered themselves on ropes into the half-buried chambers to see what had survived. What they found there, beneath centuries of earth and silence, were painted gardens, birds in impossible colors, tendrils of vine and flower curling along borders, mythological figures placed with an almost playful ease, as though they had simply settled there, naturally, like leaves coming to rest on still water. The style those later artists discovered and marveled at would go on to influence the entire tradition of European decorative painting. From darkness and ruin, beauty had been teaching itself forward across the centuries. The vaults of the entrance hall, which was itself grand enough to have housed entire city blocks of ordinary Roman buildings, contained a colossal statue of Nero himself, some 120 feet tall, according to the ancient reports, gilded and standing in the attitude of the sun god. The statue was the building made flesh in a sense, an image of the man who believed, or who at least performed the belief, that he stood at the juncture between the human and the divine. It is said that Nero walked through the completed house for the first time and declared with something very close to satisfaction that now at last he was being housed as a human being ought to be. One can hear in that sentence whatever one wishes, the grandiosity certainly, but also perhaps something almost plaintive, the weariness of a man who had spent his life in rooms that felt to him too small for the self he carried. And then there was the gold, not merely the name, not merely decoration, but gold worked into the ceilings and the walls in the form of leaf and paint and mosaic, set off by inlays of mother-of-pearl and semi-precious stones, carnelian and lapis, and the cool green weight of malachite. The dining rooms had ivory ceilings, fitted with pipes, the ancient writers tell us, through which perfumed water could be sprinkled down upon the guests, and flower petals, rose petals, violet petals, could be released to drift, slowly, silently, through the warm air of the room. Even the imagination of excess here becomes something strangely meditative, if you allow yourself to simply float within it, rather than judge it. The petals falling in the lamplight, the slow turn of the celestial ceiling, the sound of the artificial lake outside, its water catching the moon. None of it lasted, of course, in the way that beauty rarely does when it is built too swiftly and at too great a cost to too many. Even in Nero's lifetime, the murmur of complaint was already present, the sense among the people and among the senators that hundreds of acres of the city's heart had been swallowed by one man's appetite, that the gardens where ordinary Romans might have lived and traded and moved freely had become the private dream of the emperor. After Nero was gone, the estate was progressively dismantled, built over, reduced. The great lake was drained to make the foundation for the Colosseum. The hillside chambers were buried. The gardens were returned in various ways to something more communal. The Golden House became, over centuries, simply the ground that other things stood upon. And yet it persisted. It persisted in the memory of those who had seen it, in the written astonishment of those who described it, and most remarkably, in its own buried rooms, where the frescoes waited in the dark for someone to lower a torch through a crack in the earth and find them still glowing, still impossible, still suggesting that once, in the first century of the Common Era, someone had tried to make a world that was entirely made of light. The lamplight of that world, the real oil lamps set in their niches along the gilded corridors, the torches reflected in the lake's still surface on a windless Roman evening, all of that light has long since gone out, absorbed into the dark of centuries, but the idea of it remains, warm and faintly impossible, the way a story remains after the telling is done. Let your thoughts drift now toward the wider empire that surrounded all of this, the roads and trade winds in distant provinces that stretched away from Nero's golden rooms in every direction, the vast human world that moved and breathed and carried its goods across water and land, largely indifferent to the dreams of any single man, however gilded. All of that is waiting quietly, and there is no hurry. Rest now, and let it come to you when it will. Somewhere beyond the golden walls of Rome, beyond the last lamplight flickering at the edge of the Palatine hill, the world was enormously, unhurriedly alive. It did not wait for emperors. It did not pause in its breathing to take note of decrees or proclamations carried in leather satchels along stone roads. It simply continued, as it always had, in its 10,000 separate rhythms, the rhythms of tide and harvest, of camel bells and loom weights, of fish pulled silver from dark water before the sun had fully risen over the rim of the sea. And over all of it, nominally, quietly, at a distance that would have been difficult to truly imagine even for the most well-traveled mind in Rome, there presided a young man who loved music and did not always sleep. Let us leave him there for a while in his palace and travel outward. Let us follow the roads first, because the roads are where the empire announces itself most clearly, where it insists upon its own reality in the most physical and unambiguous way. The Via Appia stretches south from Rome in long straight increments, its great flat stones worn smooth by centuries of feet, sandaled feet, bare feet, the hooves of mules and oxen, the iron-rimmed wheels of wagons, carrying amphorae of olive oil and salt fish and rough red wine. In the early morning light, the road steams gently with dew, and along its edges the tombs of wealthy Romans stand in quiet rows, their inscriptions slowly softening in the weather. A courier passes, riding hard, his satchel sealed with wax, carrying words from one corner of the world to another. He does not look at the tombs. He has miles yet to cover before the sun is properly overhead. Southward, southward, the land opens into the wide warm bay of Neapolis, where the air smells of sulfur from the restless hills, and the sea glitters in a particular shade of blue that painters from the eastern provinces are said to have spent their whole careers attempting to name. Fishing boats move on that water in the early hours, their nets trailing like long, dark thoughts beneath the surface. The fishermen speak a dialect that a Roman senator would have found barely intelligible, and they care very little for the affairs of the Palatine. What they care for is the wind, and whether it will hold, and whether the catch will be good enough to carry to the market in the afternoon and still leave something for their own table come evening. Further south still, across the narrow crossing of water, lies the great island of Sicilia, where the wheat grows in long golden fields that feed a remarkable portion of the city of Rome, without Rome ever quite pausing to be grateful for it. The farmers there move through their days in the deep heat of summer with a patient, unhurried efficiency, their skin darkened by generations of the same sun. Their knowledge of the soil, accumulated over lifetimes and passed down in quiet conversation at the ends of long working days. Rome is a word to them, a fact, the way the sky is a fact, enormous, present, occasionally meaningful, but not the thing around which ordinary life actually turns. Across the Mediterranean now, let the mind travel with the trade winds, those steady, dependable currents of air that the sailors of the first century understood with an intimacy that was almost devotional. The winds blow from the northwest in the summer months, filling the square linen sails of merchant vessels heavy with grain and glass and bolts of dyed cloth. The sailors read them the way a scholar reads a page of text, with attention, with a kind of respect, and with the accumulated understanding of everything that has come before. Below the deck of such a ship, in the warm, creaking dark, amphorae stand wedged in sand, full of wine from the vineyards of southern Gaul, destined for the markets of Alexandria. Alexandria, and here the empire reveals something of its astonishing breadth, for this city at the edge of the Egyptian delta is so large, so dense with languages and trades and competing philosophies, that it almost constitutes a world unto itself. Its great lighthouse, one of the wonders that travelers speak of in reverential tones, throws its beam out over the dark water each night with a calm and mechanical faithfulness that the city's long and complicated history has never quite managed to interrupt. In the markets near the harbor, a merchant might conduct business in Greek in the morning, haggle in Aramaic by midday, and share a meal in the evening with someone who speaks a dialect of Egyptian that stretches back unbroken for thousands of years before Rome was anything at all. All of this moves and breathes and persists under the distant nominal authority of a young man who has recently begun to develop a deep interest in theatrical performance. North now, northward and westward across the great internal sea, across to the coast of what Rome calls Hispania, where silver comes out of the mountains in quantities that have made certain families extraordinarily wealthy and given the empire's treasury a solidity it might otherwise have lacked. The mines there are places of immense noise during the working day, the ringing of iron against rock, the creak of wooden machines lifting stone and water, the coughing of dust. But in the evenings, when the work is stopped, the hills fall into a particular quality of silence that seems almost like relief. The stars come out over Hispania with a clarity that travelers from the city of Rome remark upon, because in Rome, the stars are always somewhat dimmed by lamplight and the breath of 400,000 people crowded together on 7 hills. And northward still, into Gaul, into the province that Julius Caesar had conquered with such famous difficulty a little over a century before the time of our story, and which has since settled into something approaching, not quite contentment perhaps, but a kind of working accommodation with its Roman administration. In the towns along the great rivers, Roman temples and Celtic shrines stand in not entirely comfortable proximity. Roman magistrates hold court in the mornings. In the afternoons, Druids, though officially their practices have been discouraged, as it is said, for several generations now, continue to pass their knowledge from elder to younger, in ways that Roman law has found it easier to ignore than to truly suppress. The rivers here move dark and slow through forests of oak and ash, and the fog in the mornings is very thick, and the sound of water over stones is the sound that this particular piece of the world has used to mark the passage of time since long before anyone thought to build a road through it. Eastward, always further eastward, the empire encounters its limits, and its limits are themselves enormously interesting. The province of Syria lies at the hinge of the known world, the place where the Roman order meets the Persian world, in a long, complicated border that is perpetually being negotiated through a combination of diplomacy, threat, occasional violence, and intermarriage that no official document has ever quite managed to fully capture. The city of Antioch breathes with a particular energy, a city of crossroads, of languages piling up on one another, of goods arriving from places that most Romans could not have located on a map. Silk comes through here, eventually, from the east. Silk so fine it is said you can read through it. passed hand to hand across distances so vast that by the time it reaches a Roman noblewoman's shoulders, it has already traveled further than most Romans will travel in a lifetime. And in the province of Judea, which is never entirely calm and which will, in only a few years now, erupt into a conflict that will reshape that corner of the world entirely, for now, in this particular moment, there is a tense ordinary quiet. The markets of Jerusalem move with their daily commerce. Priests tend to the great temple in the procedures and rituals that are the living memory of a very ancient covenant. Roman soldiers stand at their posts with the faintly bored attentiveness of men stationed far from home and uncertain when or whether they will be rotated back again. All of this, the wheat fields and the lighthouses, the trade winds and the river fogs, the silver mines and the silk roads and the harbor markets and the hilltop shrines, all of this constitutes the world that presses, gently and insistently, against the gilded surfaces of Nero's Rome. It is a world that has its own needs, its own voices, its own accumulated weight of time, and in the years just ahead, some of those voices will begin in their various ways to make themselves heard closer and closer to the center of things. For now, though, let the world simply breathe in its vastness. Let the trade winds fill the sails, let the lamplight burn steadily at the edge of the harbor, and the stars come out over the distant hills, and the rivers move dark and slow through the night. The lamps had been burning for a long time now, and somewhere in the palace the smell of warm oil and melted wax had become so constant, so woven into the stone and silk of the place, that no one noticed it anymore. It was simply the smell of power, the smell of proximity to Caesar, as unremarkable and as ever-present as breath. It is in this atmosphere of accumulated lamplight, of corridors that had known too many secrets for too many years, that we find ourselves in the 64th and 65th years of the Common Era, when the whispers that had always drifted through Roman aristocratic houses began to take on a different quality, slower, more deliberate, the kind of whispers that men lean into rather than away from. Rome had been rebuilt in ash and ambition after the Great Fire, and Nero moved through his glittering, half-finished Domus Aurea like a man who believed himself to have survived the worst the world could offer. And perhaps that certainty, that ease, was itself the thing that invited what came next. For there is something about a man who feels untouchable that reminds other men of their own smallness, and in that smallness, the story goes, certain seeds take root. The conspiracy that gathered itself in those months was not born from a single grievance, nor from a single kind of man. It is said that the plot wove together senators who had grown weary of watching their ancient dignity reduced to theater, military officers who felt the old virtues of the Republic, however faded, however long gone, still deserved some echo in the present, and men of letters who had watched philosophy and art bent into instruments of flattery. What held them loosely together was a shared belief that Nero could be removed, and that a Rome without him might breathe again. The name most often spoken at the play at center of this gathering was Gaius Calpurnius Piso, a man of considerable charm and good family, handsome in the way that Roman aristocrats were trained to be, generous with his table and his conversation, and possessed of the kind of easy dignity that makes people imagine a better world under his stewardship. Whether Piso was truly suited to rule, or whether he was simply the most agreeable name that could be agreed upon, is something the sources do not quite resolve. The plan was, in its essential shape, the kind of plan that sounds straightforward when spoken in a low voice over wine, by lamplight, and terrifyingly fragile the moment one begins to examine it in daylight. Nero would be killed, at the circus or in the palace, or during some social occasion where access might be obtained. The details shifted with each telling, each revision, each new person admitted into the secret. And that perhaps was where it began to fail, for the conspiracy grew as conspiracies sometimes do, not because more hands made the work lighter, but because more mouths made the silence impossible. It is said that among the many people drawn into the widening circle of the plot was a woman named Epicharis, whose role in the whole affair is remembered with a kind of quiet admiration in the ancient sources. She was not of the senatorial class, not a person of grand lineage, and yet she had apparently learned enough of the conspiracy's shape to attempt, on her own initiative, to bring into the plot a naval officer whose loyalty she believed might be secured. He was not secured. He went instead to Nero, and the unraveling began. What followed moved quickly, as these things do once the first thread is pulled. Arrests came, interrogations came. The particular atmosphere of Rome in those weeks is one that the imagination settles into slowly, the way an ordinary morning could tip without warning into something irreversible. The way a man might receive a summons and know, with a cold certainty, that the lamp burning in the room he was about to enter was the last warm light he would see for some time. Some of those arrested broke under questioning and gave names. Some gave names without being asked, hoping that information could be traded for life. Names led to more names, and the list of those accused stretched outward in widening rings, touching people who had genuinely been involved, people who had only heard a rumor, people who had once said something careless at a dinner, and people who, it seems quite possible, had done nothing at all except to be known by someone who had. Piso, when the moment came, chose not to act. The story goes that he had chances, small windows, in which the original plan might still have been executed, but he let them pass, and then the window was simply gone. He died by his own hand before soldiers could come for him, and with him, the conspiracy as a functioning thing ceased to exist, though its consequences would continue spreading for months. Epicharis, it is said, endured interrogation with a steadiness that the ancient writers recorded in tones of something close to wonder. She gave no names, not one. She was tortured, and she gave nothing, and the following day, when she was to be questioned again and could no longer physically walk, she was brought to the interrogation in a chair, and there she died by her own means, before a single word could be compelled from her. Her name is worth holding gently for a moment, here in the quiet, because it belongs to a person who chose silence as her final act, in a season that was otherwise defined by the sound of names being spoken. Among the names that came forward, either through accusation or through the terrible arithmetic of association, was that of Lucius Ananius Seneca, the philosopher, the tutor, the man who had helped shape a young emperor's mind across those early years, who had written letters about the good life and the examined soul, who had tried, or so he said, or so we might charitably believe, to be a steadying influence in a place not especially designed for steadiness. Whether Seneca was actually part of the conspiracy is a question that the ancient sources leave genuinely open, and modern historians have not resolved it with any great confidence. The evidence against him was thin, built largely on the testimony of men with reasons to name names, and on the fact of his proximity to disaffected circles. But proximity, in the 65th year, was sufficient. The account of Seneca's death is one that has come down through the centuries in a form that feels almost deliberately composed, as though the philosopher himself, or those who remembered him, wished it to carry the weight of his philosophy intact. He received word from Nero that he was to die, and he received it, the story goes, with a composure that his friends found harder to bear than grief would have been. He spoke to them of what he had believed and written, reminded them that the principles he had laid out about facing death with equanimity were not simply words to be admired from a distance, but were in fact intended for exactly this kind of mourning. His wife, Pompeia Paulina, chose to die with him, though Nero's representatives intervened and had her wounds bound, keeping her alive against her will. Seneca's own death came slowly, his body not cooperating with the speed his circumstances required, and so it was prolonged and difficult in the way that the deaths of even the most philosophical men sometimes stubbornly are. Other voices were silenced in that same season. The poet Lucan, who had been Nero's contemporary and had moved from imperial favor into the orbit of the conspiracy, whether out of principle or wounded pride or some mixture of both that we cannot now untangle, died young, it is said, composing lines of his own poetry as the end came. Petronius, the elegant, ironic author of the Satyricon, and a man Nero had once apparently regarded as the great arbiter of taste, died somewhat later, and the account of his death suggests a man determined to make even dying into something graceful and deliberately unhurried, as though he were simply excusing himself from a party that had gone on slightly too long. The purges continued past any reasonable containment of the original conspiracy, as purges tend to do, moving by their own momentum through the senatorial class and leaving behind them a Rome that was quieter, yes, but quiet in the way that rooms are quiet after something has been removed from them. a quiet with a shape, a particular texture, a faint smell of singed wood and melted wax that reminded everyone who walked those corridors of what burning cost. And still, the lamps in the palace burned on, steady and ordinary, the oil doing what oil does, consuming itself to produce light, gradually, without drama, hour by hour through the night. In the next stretch of our story, the world outside the palace walls will begin to make itself heard in ways that even lamplight cannot soften, and the silence that the purges had created will be filled, slowly, by something altogether different coming in from the provinces. But that is a story for another quiet night, and for now there is only the soft gutter of flame, and the dark, and the restful permission to let all of it go, until morning. The torches along the Palatine corridors had always burned with such certainty, such unwavering confidence in their own light, guttering only when a servant passed too quickly beneath them, then steadying again into their long, faithful columns of amber and gold. But in those final months, those last slow seasons of the rain, even the torches seemed to hesitate, as though the air itself had grown uncertain, as though something in the atmosphere of the palace had changed in ways too subtle for the eye to name but too persistent for the body to ignore. There was a quality to the stillness now that was different from the stillness of before. It was not the stillness of peace, but the stillness of held breath, of a world quietly gathering itself before some change it could already feel coming in its oldest bones. It had begun far away, as so many endings do, in a province that most inhabitants of Rome would have struggled to find easily on a painted map. Hispania Tarraconensis lay out beyond the western edges of the familiar world, a landscape of dry red earth and ancient olive groves, of rivers that ran slow and copper-colored through long summer afternoons, of soldiers who had spent years at their posts in a land that was neither home nor entirely foreign. And there, in the early months of what we count now as 68 years after the birth of Christ, a governor named Servius Sulpicius Galba allowed his name to be spoken aloud in ways that governors were not, in the ordinary course of things, supposed to permit. He was old, by the standards of men who sought power, already in his 70s it is said, with a manner that was stern and unadorned, nothing at all like the theatrical warmth that Nero had always draped around himself like a second garment. And yet precisely because of this, because he seemed to represent something stripped of ornament, something austere and almost deliberately unlovable, certain men looked toward him and saw a future they preferred to the present they were living. Galba's declaration against Nero when it came was not quite a roar, but rather a slow and deliberate announcement, like a door being firmly closed. He styled himself not emperor, but something more careful, something that gestured toward the old language of the Republic, the servant of the Senate and the Roman people. And in that careful phrasing there was an implicit accusation, a quiet insistence that what existed now in Rome was something that needed to be stepped away from, gently but firmly, the way one steps away from a fire that has grown larger than the hearth it was built in. And he was not alone. Almost at the same moment, or near enough that the news arrived in Rome in a kind of terrible doubling, a man named Gaius Julius Vindex had already moved in Gaul, raising his voice in what forces he could gather against the reign. Vindex was not himself angling for the purple, the story goes, but was rather throwing his energy behind the idea of change itself, behind the sense that the empire deserved something different, something it could not precisely name, but could feel the absence of. His revolt would be put down militarily, and Vindex himself would not survive the year, but the message of what he had attempted could not be as easily suppressed as the man. Messages of that kind have a way of moving through stone walls and across bodies of water, carried in the low voices of soldiers around campfires, in the careful letters of senators who wrote between the lines of ordinary correspondence, in the expressions on the faces of freedmen who had once been loyal and now moved through the palace hallways with something newly and quietly withheld. Nero, in Rome, received this news in ways that those around him found difficult to interpret. There were moments of apparent calm, moments when he seemed almost indifferent to what was unfolding in the provinces, as though the distance made it unreal, as though the fires in his own chambers and the music of his own voice were enough to fill the world and leave no room for approaching darkness. And then there were other moments, reported with the careful vagueness of people describing something they are not certain they understood. Moments of extraordinary agitation, of plans made and unmade, of edicts drafted and then set aside, of expressions on the emperor's face that those who saw them did not quite know how to record. He spoke, it is said, of going to the provinces himself, of meeting his enemies with the force of his presence, of taking the stage before soldiers, the way he had taken it before audiences in the great theaters of the Greek East, where crowds had roared his name until the colonnades shook with it. But the going never happened. The days continued to pass, and Nero remained, and the torches continued their uncertain burning. The Senate, which had been managing its relationship with Nero for years, with the exhausted diplomacy of men walking a surface they know to be unreliable, now began to shift its weight in ways that could not be mistaken for anything other than what it was. There is something almost geological about the way institutions of that kind move, so slowly that any single moment of observation seems to show stillness, and yet when you compare the position of one year against another, the distance traveled is unmistakable. The Senate had praised Nero when praise was required, and had been silent when silence was safer, and had watched from behind its collective composed expression as the years of his reign had moved through their seasons of promise and turbulence and grief. Now, in these last months, the silence changed its quality. It became not the silence of caution, but the silence of calculation, of men who were beginning to count things and consider distances, and think about what their names might look like when all of this was written down by someone else in a later age. And then the army. This was the final thing, the deepest thing, because it was the army that had always been the truest foundation beneath every emperor's feet, more fundamental than the Senate's approval, or the crowd's warmth, or the philosopher's praise. An emperor without the army's loyalty was a man standing on water. And when the legions of Galba's cause began to accumulate the support of units that might once have been expected to hold their position for Nero, when the Praetorian Guard itself, those soldiers whose entire purpose and identity had been bound up with the protection of the emperor's person, when they too began to speak amongst themselves in ways that their officers did not move quickly enough to silence, the architecture of everything began to be visible for what it actually was. Not stone, not the permanent settled weight of something that would endure forever, but something assembled, something maintained through ongoing acts of faith and mutual interest, and capable of disassembly in the same quiet and incremental way it had been built. The household was the last to go, and perhaps this is what made it the hardest thing of all. The people who lived within the walls of the palace, who had served the emperor through all the years of his reign, who had dressed him and attended him and learned his rhythms the way musicians learn a difficult piece until they can play it without thinking. These people too began to move away, not dramatically, not in a single declaration, but in ones and twos and small silent clusters, like the way a flock of birds will rise from a field without any apparent signal, each one lifting away until the field is empty and the sky has absorbed them all. Freedmen who had been fixtures of the imperial household disappeared into other arrangements, other households, other lives they had apparently been quietly imagining while they went about their daily duties. Guards who had stood outside certain doors for years were reassigned or were simply no longer there when one looked for them. The particular sounds of the palace, the footsteps, the voices at certain distances, the low, constant hum of a household in motion, these grew quieter, and in growing quieter revealed how much of the warmth of those spaces had been made by human presence, rather than by the torches and braziers that remained burning in their holders, faithful to the end. And so the night that was coming had been assembling itself for a long time, out of all these small withdrawals, all these quiet reorientations, all these individual choices made by individual people in the dimness of their own minds and hearts. The empire had not collapsed in a roar. It had grown still, the way a flame grows still when there is nothing left to feed it, hovering for a moment in its own light, beautiful and diminishing, before it goes out. There is one more night to settle into, one final chapter of quiet to drift through, and it waits for you just beyond the soft edge of sleep, unhurried, already growing still, already burning low. The road outside Rome was dark, and the air smelled of pine resin and turned earth, and somewhere not far off, a small animal moved through the undergrowth, with a soft, unhurried rustling that was the only sound in all the world. It was June, the month of long evenings and warm nights, the month when the city Nero had known his entire life should have been fragrant with dinners, cooling on terraces, and the distant murmur of fountains, and the flicker of 1,000 oil lamps burning in 1,000 windows across the hills. But on this particular night, in the early hours before dawn in the year 68, the lamps of the Palatine burned without him. He had left, or rather he had fled, which is a different thing entirely, and the difference weighed on him in ways that the ancient sources suggest he could barely articulate, even to himself. He had gone to bed the previous evening, it is said, with the Senate's condemnation still undelivered, still theoretical, still a thing that might perhaps be reversed or softened, or somehow survived. But somewhere in the deep middle of the night, he had woken to find that his guards had gone, the praetorians who had stood at his door, whose boots he had heard shifting on marble for years, whose presence had been as constant and unthinking a backdrop to his life as lamplight itself. They were simply not there, and the silence where they had been was louder than any sound he had ever heard on a stage, or in a circus, or in the great gilded halls of his Domus Aurea. He is said to have gone from room to room, calling for people, slaves, servants, companions, anyone. In the palace, that vast, extraordinary lamp-bright world of colored marble and vaulted ceilings and rooms that seemed to belong to a dream of what a palace might be, returned only his own voice to him. Softened and strange, like something heard underwater. A few people remained. Accounts vary on exactly who, but the story goes that a small group of freedmen stayed with him. Phaon, whose house outside the city would become the last place Nero ever sheltered. Epaphroditus, whose name the sources record with a kind of quiet faithfulness, and one or two others whose names have drifted, over centuries, into the gentle uncertainty of history. And Sporus was there, the young man Nero had loved and kept close to him in the last years of his life, and who is said to have wept openly as they prepared to leave. They left the palace on horseback, just a handful of figures moving through the sleeping city in the hour before the city began to wake, and they rode north along the Via Nomentana toward the estate of Phaon, which lay perhaps 4 miles beyond the walls. The ancient writers describe this journey with a kind of muted strangeness, as if the details they recorded, the sounds, the smells, the small accumulated textures of the night, were themselves trying to make sense of how the most powerful man in the Roman world had come to be riding through darkness in a borrowed cloak, with his face half hidden. There was an earthquake somewhere in the distance, or what felt like one, a trembling in the ground, it is said, that Nero felt through his horse. There were flashes of lightning, which the Romans would have read as portents, as the sky expressing something the earth could not yet name. And as they rode, they passed at some point, close enough to a camp of soldiers, for Nero to hear voices in the dark, hear men calling out the name of Galba, the general in Spain whose rebellion had finally broken the Senate's patience and turned the army's loyalty, and to understand, perhaps for the first time with his whole body and not merely his frightened mind, that it was already over. They reached Phaon's house before dawn. The accounts say that Nero could not or would not enter by the door, some scruple or superstition holding him back, and so he was brought in through a hole broken in the back wall, crawling through on his hands and knees in the darkness, the clay of the earth cold against his palms. Inside there was a small room, a low bed of sorts, a little bread, a little water, and lamps, always even at the end, lamps casting their amber warmth across the plain walls of a house that was nothing like any house he had ever lived in. He is said to have tried to rest. He lay down, but sleep would not come, or came only in fragments, and the ancient sources record with a kind of careful tenderness that he kept saying he needed time, that he needed a moment to compose himself for what he must do. He had been brought up in the world of philosophy after all, had sat with Seneca through long afternoons of stoic argument, had heard again and again that the wise man meets death without flinching. And yet flinching was what came naturally, and perhaps what came honestly, and there is something almost quietly human in the image of him lying on that plain bed and not quite being ready. A messenger arrived with word from Phaon, it is said, that the Senate had formally declared him a public enemy. Hostis, the word was, enemy of the state, and that the penalty, the ancient penalty, the one reserved for those the Roman world had placed entirely outside its protection, was to be beaten to death with rods. And this, more than anything, seems to have moved him. Not glory, not philosophy, not the long stoic speeches about the acceptance of fate, but the specific bodily particular fear of that particular death, which was a shameful death, a death without dignity, a death that the world Nero had grown up in would have found almost worse than death itself. He had a grave dug in the garden of Phaon's house. He asked for it, and it was dug, and he looked at it, and the sources say he wept, and said, and these words have come down through 2,000 years with a strange, quiet persistence, that such an artist was dying. It is impossible to know with any certainty whether he truly said this, whether it was a last flash of the vanity that had always lived so close beside his genuine love of music and verse and performance, or whether it was something more complicated, a man reaching for the language he knew best, in a moment when all other language had failed him. Perhaps both things were true at once. The sound of horses came along the road, not one or two horses, many, the steady drumming of a group of riders, which in that hour and in that place meant only one thing. And Nero, the sources agree, took a blade. It is said that Epaphroditus helped him, guided his hand when his own hand faltered, and he died in the pine-scented dark of a June morning, just 4 miles from the city he had ruled for nearly 14 years. Died the last of the julio-claudian line, the last direct descendant by blood and adoption of the family of Julius Caesar, the family of Augustus, the family that had shaken the Roman world for a century. The horseman who arrived first, it is said, tried to staunch the wound, tried to stop the bleeding, because the orders had been to bring Nero back alive if possible. But it was already past that. He died there in the lampless dark, the open sky above him, the smell of earth and pine resin all around him, the horses shifting and breathing softly on the road. A woman named Acte, who had been among the first people he had ever loved, before the power and the fear and all the long middle years of his reign, had him buried properly in the end. The story goes that she arranged it, paying for the tomb herself, wrapping his body in white and gold, the colors he had loved. She had him laid in the tomb of his father's family on the Pincian Hill, and the ancient writers note with a kind of gentle care that a long time afterward, people still came and left flowers on the stone. Flowers, and sometimes small offerings, as if they were not entirely sure what the right feeling was, and so they brought beauty instead, which is perhaps the most honest thing any of us can bring to a grave we do not know how to read. The oil lamps of Rome burned through that June dawn as they always had, as they had burned through every dawn of Nero's reign and every dawn before it, steady and warm and indifferent and faithful, throwing their amber light across stone and water and the slow waking faces of a city that was already, in the very first pale hours of that morning, beginning to belong to someone else. And so the lamp of his life went out, quietly, on a road in the pine woods north of the city, and all that remained were the echoes, in stone, in verse, in memory, drifting forward through the centuries toward us here tonight, in the soft dark, where all stories eventually find their rest. The fire has gone out now, and what remains is only warmth, the kind that lingers in stone long after the flame itself has died, radiating gently into the cool, dark air, asking nothing of you but that you stay a little while and feel it there. This is where we arrive together, at the far end of a long journey, through one of the most vivid, troubled, and endlessly debated lives that the ancient world ever produced. And perhaps the most fitting thing to do now, in this quiet final hour, is not to press forward any further, but simply to drift back, slowly, without urgency, letting the images and textures of Nero's world rise again like smoke from cooling embers, softly, without alarm, until they settle into something like understanding, or at least into the gentler thing that lies just on the other side of understanding, which is rest. Think for a moment of the light. All through this story, lamplight has been our companion. The small clay lamps of the Palatine, their wicks drawing oil up through narrow channels, casting their warm and trembling glow across marble floors and painted ceilings, across the faces of those who plotted and those who loved, and those who simply lived out their ordinary days beneath the enormous shadow of an emperor. That light never changed much, from the earliest chapters to the last. Whether it burned in the corridors of power or in the humblest insula apartment overlooking a narrow Roman street, it was the same light, impermanent, dependent on something being slowly consumed in order to shine at all. Beautiful because it moved, beautiful because it would eventually go out. Nero was born into that light in the coastal town of Antium, in a family so layered with danger and ambition that his very survival into childhood was something the story never quite takes for granted. His father, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, was, by many accounts, a man of considerable cruelty, though it is said he looked at his newborn son and offered the dark prophetic observation that nothing produced by himself and Agrippina could possibly be anything other than a catastrophe and a grief to the world. Whether or not those words were truly spoken, they were the kind of thing the ancient world liked to preserve, the shadow arriving with the very birth, the omen settling like dust on a threshold before the child had taken his first step. And yet the child survived, through Caligula's volatile reign, through his mother's exile, through the cold years of uncertainty, when a boy with imperial blood lived at the edge of everything, in the center of nothing, young Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus endured. There is something quietly extraordinary in that, when you hold it gently and turn it in the mind's slow light. A child navigating a world of adults for whom he was primarily a piece in a larger game, finding moments of ordinary childhood. It is said he loved horses from very early on, that he was drawn to the sound of music, that there was always something in him that wanted to create rather than only to rule, and somehow carrying those small interior sparks through years that might easily have extinguished them entirely. His mother Agrippina brought him back into the bright, dangerous center of things. She was formidable in the way that only someone who has survived exile and humiliation and the constant threat of violent death can be formidable. Absolutely certain of what she wanted, tireless in her pursuit of it, and willing to use every instrument available to her, including her son himself, as the primary instrument of her own ambition. Her love for Nero was real, the story seems to suggest, and yet it was the kind of love that does not easily distinguish between devotion and possession, between wanting the best for someone and wanting to remain indispensable to them forever. She placed him beside Claudius. She arranged the adoption. She smoothed the path to the purple with the same calm efficiency with which she is said to have arranged other darker things. And when he eventually moved away from her, inevitably as children do, as emperors must, the distance between them became something neither of them could quite survive intact. Seneca gave the boy something different. In those long years of education on the Palatine, in the hours of philosophy and rhetoric and careful thinking about what a good life might look like and what a just ruler might owe to those he governed, there was perhaps a version of Nero that genuinely reached towards something worthy. The early years of his reign, those years the ancient sources sometimes called the quinquennium, the 5 good years, though scholars hold that characterization with some care, suggest a young man who was at least attempting to govern with a measure of restraint and wisdom, who listened to the counsel of those older and steadier than himself, who seemed to understand that power carried obligations as well as pleasures, a lamp burning at its clearest before the oil begins to run low. What changed is not a simple thing to name. It rarely is in any life. It was gradual, and it was multiple. The loosening of Seneca's influence, the death of Burrus, the long claustrophobic pressure of a position that offered unlimited power and almost no genuine intimacy, the hunger for art and performance and the kind of recognition that an emperor cannot safely seek without the whole world becoming a distorted mirror. Poppaea arrived, and the world rearranged itself around her. The fire came, and the city burned, and the rebuilding rose from the ash and gold and ivory, and vaulted marble ceilings painted the color of the sky. And somewhere in all of that grandeur, the human being inside the emperor became harder and harder to find. There are things we cannot know, and should not pretend to. The ancient sources who gave us most of what we have, Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, were writing from a world that had already decided what Nero was, and their accounts carry the weight of that verdict in nearly every line. The persecution of the Christians after the fire, the deaths of Seneca and Lucan, and so many others caught in the web of the Pisonian Conspiracy, the cruelties both real and elaborated. These things exist in the record, and they cannot be gently smoothed away. And yet historians across many centuries have also noted that the record was written by those who survived him under different emperors, and that a different archive might have told a different story. Not a better story, perhaps, but a more complete one, with more shadows in different places and more unexpected light. At the end, there was a country road outside Rome, and a small villa, and a man who had been the most powerful person in the known world, finding himself entirely alone, except for a handful of servants who had chosen, at considerable risk to themselves, to stay. The lamps of the Palatine were dark for him now. The golden house stood empty behind its walls. Whatever music remained was only the music he had always heard inside himself, the thing that had been there from the beginning, before the purple, before Agrippina's engineering, before all of it, and it is said that at the last he wept, not for his empire or his power, but simply because he felt that the world was losing an artist. Perhaps it was the truest thing he ever said about himself. Perhaps at that great distance, it is not ours to judge with any certainty. What we can say is that the lamps went out, as lamps do, and the world continued, as the world does. Other emperors came, other fires burned, other conspiracies uncoiled in other corridors, other mothers pressed their ambitions against their children's lives, other voices rose in theater and on race course and in the long, dusty halls of the Senate. Rome went on for centuries more, and somewhere in the long human memory, Nero remained, dangerous and gifted, beloved and despised, a figure too complicated for simple judgment and too vivid to forget, burning in the record like one of those small clay lamps, throwing light in uncertain directions, casting shadows that shift depending on where you stand. Let the story settle now. Let it become part of the warm dark behind your eyes, another layer of the ancient world resting quietly in the part of you that holds the things you have been told before sleep. The Tiber is still moving in the dark somewhere, slow and bronze and indifferent to emperors. The stone of the hills is still warm from a sun that set 2,000 years ago. Somewhere, a lamp has been extinguished, and the thread of smoke rises in a thin pale line toward the ceiling, and the room is still, and nothing more is required of you tonight. This is where we leave Nero, not with a verdict, but with a breath, not with certainty, but with the soft and generous ambiguity that belongs to history and to sleep alike. Rest now, wherever in the world you are. The embers are quiet. The story is complete.